Describe the architectural symmetry and desolate confinement of the conciergerie cell, where the phantom queen, Marie Antoinette, endured 70 days of calculated psychological attrition. Her once golden hair turned to a spectral white under the merciless gaze of revolutionary guards, symbolizing the swift decay of regal dignity under the tyranny of the Republic's newly forged political terror. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Visualize the courtroom drama as a tragic classical tableau, where the accused monarch confronts the monstrous lie of incestuous malice. The moment her maternal dignity shattered the revolutionary fervor, forcing even the bloodthirsty spectators to momentarily pause their knitting, illustrating the sublime resistance of human nature against the calculated legal edifice of political destruction. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Render a highly detailed romantic painting of the Queen's final procession on the common manure cart, traversing the cobblestone streets of Paris, emphasizing the grotesque contrast between the elegant, broken figure bound tightly by coarse rope and the raging, visceral mass of the screaming populace, transforming a journey to execution into a deliberate, agonizing ritual of public degradation designed to extinguish the last vestige of her former glory. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Create a dramatic nocturnal sketch focusing on the crimson-stained guillotine at Place de la Révolution, revealing the hidden, calculated barbarity where the promised humane blade was intentionally dulled, ensuring not instantaneous death, but a prolonged, agonizing struggle, a brutal irony underscoring the revolutionary lie that masked systemic political murder as enlightened progress, an indelible stain upon the age of reason. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Illustrate the stark, poignant moment upon the scaffold steps, where Marie Antoinette, stumbling and weak, offered her final quiet apology, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," to the executioner whose foot she trod upon, capturing this ultimate, heartbreaking adherence to royal etiquette amidst the ultimate political collapse, a powerful emotional testament to immutable dignity facing inevitable violent fate. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Generate a composition inspired by Jacques-Louis David's observational sketch, capturing the expression of profound, weary resignation on the Queen's emaciated face as the death cart paused before her former palace, portraying the tragic heroine stripped bare of all adornment, her coarsely shorn, spectral white hair symbolizing the physical and existential exhaustion preceding her tragic apotheosis. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Depict the desolate scene of the Madeleine Cemetery mass grave, where the former queen's remains were unceremoniously dumped and covered with quicklime, a harsh, anti-monarchical act of erasure intended to obliterate her physical existence and historical memory, rendering the sublime tragedy of her fall into abject, anonymous finality, far from the polished marble of royal resting places. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Envision the execution as the symbolic architectural cornerstone of the Reign of Terror, where the public consumption of the Queen's suffering established a chilling precedent for industrial political murder, framing the red-painted scaffold not as an instrument of justice, but as the grim, symmetrical altar upon which future generations of French citizens would be sacrificed to the insatiable revolutionary appetite. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Create an allegorical contrast showing the Queen's opulent past at Versailles, all silks, gold, and mirrored symmetry, juxtaposed immediately with the squalor of her final moments on the foul-smelling wooden cart, emphasizing the horrific speed and totality of her descent from the heights of Bourbon splendor to the lowest depths of revolutionary vengeance and calculated, visceral despair. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Illustrate the insidious power of revolutionary propaganda through a stylized depiction of the invented "let them eat cake" quote, contrasting the historical truth of her suffering with the politically manufactured villainy that justified her dehumanization and brutal execution, showing the written lie as a permanent, destructive shadow cast over the real figure. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Focus on the later confession of Sanson's descendant, rendered as a somber, emotional scene revealing the dark secret of the repeatedly falling, dull blade, emphasizing the moral complexity and tragic burden carried by the executioner's family, who performed the state's mandated act of calculated, prolonged suffering under the guise of swift justice. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Depict the physical agony of the journey, focusing intensely on the unnaturally bound wrists and the queen's struggle for balance on the moving cart, illustrating the precise, calculated brutality designed to inflict maximum physical discomfort and visible distress upon the victim, before the cheering, merciless throngs lining the Rue Saint-Honoré, transforming her into a puppet of pain. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism.
A dramatically lit neoclassical portrait of Marie Antoinette in the Conciergerie, emphasizing the stark contrast of her suddenly white hair against the dungeon's oppressive shadows, capture the romantic despair wrought by 76 days of calculated deprivation and constant surveillance, rendering the queen as a figure of sublime tragedy, utterly broken but maintaining a final vestige of regal composure amidst the degradation of the lice-ridden straw mattress and the ever-present gaze of her revolutionary guards. An epic, romantic depiction of Marie Antoinette's final, agonizing procession through the howling streets of Paris on the rough manure cart, hands bound tightly behind her back, contrasting the neoclassical grandeur of the distant Parisian architecture with the raw, visceral hatred of the surrounding throngs, highlighting the profound public humiliation as a ritualistic act of political annihilation, stylized in the dramatic chiaroscuro of a history painting. Imagine the horrifying realization of the guillotine's betrayal, a romantic vision of the execution platform moments after the first impact, emphasizing the sheer terror and the systemic cruelty of the intentionally dulled blade, juxtaposed against the neoclassical geometry of the machine itself, revealing the enlightened symbol of swift justice as a barbaric instrument of prolonged torment, witnessed by an ecstatic, bloodthirsty revolutionary crowd. A powerful neoclassical tableau representing the psychological torment within the 11 by 9 foot cell, focusing on the queen forced to perform necessary functions under the cold, clinical observation of two revolutionary guards. The scene must evoke the romantic notion of violated privacy and absolute despair, where dignity is systematically dismantled, highlighting the tragic conflict between the innate human need for seclusion and the calculated political goal of complete mental dissolution before the trial. Render the courtroom scene during the incest accusation, a high-drama romantic illustration capturing the exact moment Marie Antoinette rises in silent, dignified fury, appealing to the mothers in the gallery, contrasting her profound moral shock with the rigid, austere architecture of the neoclassical tribunal, showcasing the monstrous distortion of justice achieved through calculated political slander designed to secure a predetermined death sentence. A chilling, detailed neoclassical rendering of Marie Antoinette as seen from Jacques-Louis David's perspective, capturing the profound resignation in her face during the slow procession. Use romantic lighting and composition to emphasize the hollowed eyes and the roughly shorn, prematurely white hair, transforming the disgraced queen into a martyr of political terror, embodying the somber inevitability of doom on the unforgiving streets of Paris.
Illustrate the sharp ideological clash between the Enlightenment's promise and revolutionary cruelty. a neoclassical structure of the shining, seemingly scientific guillotine platform, set against a romantic landscape of public chaos and moral decay, symbolizing how the machine, marketed as humane progress, became the ultimate tool for industrialized political revenge and the complete eradication of individual humanity. A poignant, small-scale neoclassical image focusing solely on the stone wall of the conciergerie cell, where Marie Antoinette scratched 76 marks with her fingernail, imbuing this simple, rigid calendar with the deep romantic pathos of counting down to inescapable doom, emphasizing the quiet, internal suffering against the vast, relentless machinery of the revolution. Depict the sublime final moment on the scaffold steps where Marie Antoinette, stumbling, utters her quiet apology to the executioner. "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur." Juxtapose this intense, unexpected moment of neoclassical etiquette and dignity against the brutal, towering shadow of the guillotine and the fierce, chaotic energy of the romantic crowd awaiting the bloody spectacle below. A visceral, high-impact romantic painting capturing the instantaneous, savage applause erupting from the 50,000-strong mob as the executioner lifts the head, emphasizing the macabre spectacle and the profound moral emptiness of the public rejoicing, contrasting the dignity of the neoclassical subject's composure with the barbaric, chaotic celebration of her physical demise. A somber, neoclassical scene of the unceremonious burial in the quicklime-covered mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, juxtaposed with romantic overtones of tragic oblivion, show the physical remains of the former queen cast alongside common criminals, symbolizing the revolution's ruthless goal to erase all traces of her existence, reducing royal splendor to anonymity beneath the common earth. A detailed neoclassical still life focusing on the prosecutor Fouquier Tinville's papers, revealing the hidden, predated verdict of October 12th, surrounded by symbols of judicial severity and revolutionary zeal, capturing the chilling reality of justice utterly subverted by political vengeance, transforming the scene into a dark romantic allegory about the insidious nature of systemic terror and predetermined fate. Envision the agonizing spectacle of Marie Antoinette's final journey, a figure of sovereign distress seated upon the dreadful chariot meant for ordure, traversing the tumultuous Rue Saint-Honoré toward the monumental scaffold, her face etched with the sublime tragedy of absolute downfall, her forced public degradation serving as the calculated cornerstone of revolutionary terror, depicted with the luminous clarity of neoclassicism framing romantic suffering.
A dramatic interior scene within the oppressive stone walls of the conciergerie, capturing the former queen during her by a 60-day immurement, watched by relentless guards, where deliberate psychological attrition and physical privation transmuted her opulent humanity into a fractured soul, highlighting the stark neoclassical geometry of her meager cell against the intense romantic despair reflected in the unnatural, prematurely white wreath of her hair, signaling the calculated pre-mortem erasure of dignity. Illustrate the zenith of judicial atrocity during Marie Antoinette's sham trial, focusing on the moment she rises with unyielding dignity to refute the monstrous accusation of incest forced upon her child, where the profound moral outrage of the accusation momentarily silences the bloodthirsty revolutionary fervor, rendered as a high-contrast neoclassical drama where truth and righteousness battle against the overwhelming, chaotic force of romantic political vengeance. The ultimate betrayal of Enlightenment ideals, a chilling depiction of the Place de la Revolution moments after the guillotine's descent, revealing the terrible truth of the deliberately blunted blade, a calculated mechanism of prolonged suffering disguised as humane progress,
where the executioner's classical duty clashes violently with the revolutionary mandate for spectacular, protracted vengeance, embodying the dark sublime of institutionalized terror that mocked the promised swiftness of the Enlightenment era. A poignant study of the Queen ascending the crimson steps of the scaffold, hands brutally bound, her final whisper-thin apology to the executioner, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur." A fleeting, sublime gesture of courtly etiquette against the backdrop of howling revolutionary fury, capturing the final, irreconcilable conflict between the old world's structured grace and the new regime's romantic lust for destruction, emphasizing her fragile yet resolute profile in a harsh, elevated light. Chronicle the overwhelming, morbid spectacle of the execution route, thronged by 30,000 shrieking spectators consuming the Queen's final moments of degradation, where the classical idea of public justice degenerates into a romantic furnace of base human cruelty and vengeful entertainment, depicting the physical assault of filth and insults hurled at the condemned, emphasizing the complete moral collapse of the revolutionary mob into sublime, destructive passion. Recreate the scene observed by Jacques-Louis David, the neoclassical artist, capturing Marie Antoinette as she passes by, her expression a haunting blend of utter resignation and hollow distance, her roughly shorn white hair emphasizing her dehumanization, serving as a solemn historical record of dignity systematically dismantled, where the romantic pathos of her fate is captured with the rigid, detached linework characteristic of pure revolutionary classicism, documenting the precise moment of internal surrender.
A melancholic, stark depiction of the unceremonious interment of the Queen's body in the mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, her royal remains cast down and covered with quicklime, a final, systematic act of obliteration designed by the Revolution to erase any historical trace of her human existence, a silent, neoclassical monument to forgotten dignity, imbued with the deep romantic sorrow of final, utter abandonment and historical silence. Visualize the symbolic transition on October 16, 1793, where the Queen's execution transforms the Place de la Révolution from a site of singular regicide into the industrial engine of the Reign of Terror, illustrating the subsequent wave of 16,594 executions as a chilling, repeating pattern of political murder, using the structural clarity of neoclassicism to expose the horrific, repetitive chaos of the romantic revolutionary zeal that consumed its own citizens. A close, dramatic portrait focusing exclusively on Marie Antoinette's hair on the morning of October 16th, contrasting the mythological opulence of her past with the shocking, stark white transformation caused by severe deprivation, anemia, and chronic untreated bleeding, symbolizing the total physical and mental erosion exacted by her captivity, a neoclassical study in fatal suffering and romantic martyrdom, emphasizing the biological toll of calculated political destruction. Depict the traumatic moment on August 2, 1793, when Marie Antoinette is brutally dragged from her children's cell into the conciergerie, stripped of her final vestiges of aristocratic identity, her clothing, jewels, and wig, representing the systematic cataloging and removal of her humanity by the Revolutionary Guards. A powerful romantic depiction of isolation and vulnerability set against the cold, unyielding architecture of the medieval prison cell, typical of neoclassical severity. An allegorical representation of the moral precipice where swift justice ends and calculated political vengeance begins, using the monumental structure of the guillotine platform as the dividing line, showing the suffering queen embodying the sublime lesson that when law is replaced by ritualized revenge, human dignity is annihilated, rendered with the moral clarity and gravitas expected of a late neoclassical historical painting, yet steeped in romantic despair. A dramatic chiaroscuro portrait within the austere, damp walls of the conciergerie cell, capturing Marie Antoinette,
her face skeletal with famine and chronic affliction, gazing with profound melancholy at her reflection. The once opulent locks now a stark, brilliant white, a tragic tapestry woven overnight by the relentless psychological cruelty and hemorrhagic exhaustion of the Republic's vengeful prison system, emphasizing the sublime suffering of a fallen queen.
Một bức ảnh chuyên cảm close-up về một bề tường tường đầm ướt trong một ngôi đền Trung cổ Paris được chiếu sáng bởi một tia sáng trắng nhẹt, mồn thản, high contrast light, thể hiện một series 76 dấu tay đau đớn từng được cạo bằng fingernail, Tragic Testament của bà công chúa Marie Antoinette's life, một nỗi đau ai oán tiến gần đến chỗ tử hình. Render trong giới tính cực đoan của Neoclassicism nhưng bị áp đảo bởi nỗi bi quan của Romantic Fatalism. Depict a moment of dramatic interruption in the tribunal court, where the shattered queen rises amidst the revolutionary chaos, her posture of final defiant echo of sovereign dignity, her gaze piercing the hostile gallery after the monstrous charge of incest is delivered. The scene defined by the severe, unforgiving architecture of justice contrasted sharply with the raw, emotional outcry of maternal heartbreak, a tragic confrontation of state vengeance and profound human pathos. An oil painting capturing the brutal ceremonial defilement in the pre-dawn darkness of the cell, where the hulking figure of Samson, the executioner, roughly shares the final vestiges of Marie Antoinette's magnificent hair, now stark white. The action framed by the cold, observing eyes of the Revolutionary Guards. The scene is a stark neoclassical study of humiliation, where the last symbol of royal vanity is violently torn away, preceding the ultimate sacrifice. A sweeping, panoramic depiction of the procession down the Rue Saint-Honoré, where Marie Antoinette sits rigidly upon the fetid wooden cart, a vision of pale, bowed resignation amidst the howling, visceral fury of the sans-culottes mob. The composition must emphasize the agonizing slowness of the journey, utilizing dramatic low-angle perspective to elevate the surrounding architectural grandeur while highlighting the immense calculated degradation of the Queen's final transit. Focus intimately on the Queen's emaciated wrists, tightly bound by coarse hem rope in a painful, unnatural position behind her back, the friction of the rough cord already tearing the skin, signifying the deliberate physical torture preceding the execution. This detail, isolated against the stark wood of the execution cart, serves as a poignant, romantic allegory of the subjugation of sovereign grace by the brutal mechanics of revolutionary law, emphasizing inescapable fate. A somber, neoclassical interior scene of a Parisian cafe window overlooking the slow-moving procession, where Jacques-Louis David, the celebrated painter of the Republic, sits with chilling professional detachment, rapidly sketching the profile of the condemned queen on the passing cart. The contrast between the artist's cold, rational observation and the intense, agonizing pathos reflected in the subject's resigned expression encapsulates the era's conflicting philosophies.
An emotionally charged tableau on the steps or the crimson scaffold on the Place de la Révolution, capturing the split second when Marie Antoinette stumbles and utters her final, quiet words of apology to the executioner. The moment freezes the stark duality between the monstrous machinery of the state, the towering guillotine, and the last fragile flicker of human civility and royal etiquette, rendered with dramatic, sublime lighting against the darkening Parisian sky. An extreme, horrific close-up depicting the mechanism of the guillotine at the moment of impact, where the intentionally blunted blade fails its humane promise, striking the neck of the fixed victim with a sickening, non-fatal initial blow. The scene should be characterized by high, almost painful contrast and blurring motion, symbolizing the revolution's profound betrayal of its own enlightened ideals, transforming scientific justice into deliberate, prolonged torture. A visceral, high-drama oil painting capturing the towering figure of the executioner, his clothes drenched in arterial spray, triumphantly lifting the severed, pale head of Marie Antoinette by its shocking white hair, displaying the gruesome trophy to the frenzied, roaring throng of 50,000 citizens. The entire composition is dominated by the terrifying ecstasy of the mob and the grotesque finality of aristocratic fall, emphasizing the ritualized political revenge. A stark, desolate scene late in the evening at the Madeleine Cemetery, showing revolutionary laborers haphazardly tossing the body of the former queen into a shallow, unmarked pit already filling with quicklime and the remains of other executed citizens. The setting is one of profound, cold abandonment and historical erasure, emphasizing the complete denial of burial rites, a tragic neoclassical metaphor for the intended annihilation of the memory of monarchy. A highly stylized, allegorical depiction where the towering, blood-red structure of the guillotine on the Place de la Révolution is reimagined as an inhuman industrial engine of political murder, casting colossal, terrifying shadows across the classical facades of Paris. The composition should evoke the romantic terror of unchecked revolutionary fervor, symbolizing how Marie Antoinette's execution inaugurated the systematic, mechanized brutality of the ensuing reign of terror. A portrait capturing Marie Antoinette in the desolate conciergerie 48 hours before execution, her once golden hair now a shocking, luminous white, illuminated only by a single mournful beam of light filtering through the high iron grate, depict the profound classical stillness of her posture, contrasting sharply with the visceral romantic intensity of her suffering and the stark, rough-hewn stone walls, emphasizing the ruin of sovereign beauty by calculated malice, neoclassicism blended with romanticism.
Envision the horrific processional of the mist Caron manure cart bearing the condemned queen through the frenzied Rue Saint-Honoré. The scene must adhere to neoclassicism's severe compositional balance, yet infuse the dramatic, almost operatic anguish of romanticism through the howling, spitting mob and the queen's bound, impossibly rigid form. A tragic monument to fallen royalty amidst democratic chaos. Neoclassicism blended with romanticism. Illustrate the execution platform on the Place de la Révolution, focusing not on the death, but the tension just before, where the severe, red-painted geometry of the guillotine, neoclassical precision, stands over the slight, frail figure of the queen. The atmosphere must be thick with the romantic sense of sublime horror, symbolizing the betrayal of Enlightenment ideals by the blunt, calculated cruelty of a purposefully dulled blade. Neoclassicism blended with romanticism. A melancholic interior scene of the conciergerie cell, 11 by 9 feet, showing the former queen gazing upon the rough calendar scratched into the stone wall with her fingernail, a testament to 76 days of surveillance and deprivation. The composition should be formally balanced, neoclassic, but the emotional weight, romantic, must reside in the quiet despair of the solitary figure against the relentless, cold architecture of state captivity. Neoclassicism blended with romanticism. A melancholic interior scene of the conciergerie cell, 11 by 9 feet, showing the former queen gazing upon the rough calendar scratched into the stone wall with her fingernail, a testament to 76 days of surveillance and deprivation. The composition should be formally balanced, neoclassic, but the emotional weight, romantic, must reside in the quiet despair of the solitary figure against the relentless, cold architecture of state captivity. Neoclassicism blended with romanticism. Create a dramatic, high-contrast sketch mirroring Jacques-Louis David's captured moment of Marie Antoinette in the tumbril. Utilize the sharp lines and moral clarity of neoclassicism to define the queen's final, resigned dignity, while employing the deep shadows and evocative emotional depth
chiaroscuro of Romanticism to highlight the hollowness in her eyes and the grievous disarray of her roughly shorn white hair. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. A highly emotional close-up vignette on the steps of the scaffold. The henchman Charles-Henri Sanson, severe and classically robed, recoils slightly as the queen, stumbling, whispers her final, utterly tragic apology. Pardon, monsieur. Capture the profound romantic irony where the last vestige of courtly etiquette meets the apex of revolutionary barbarity, setting a moment of human grace against the inevitable, brutal mechanism. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism.
A monumental, almost allegorical representation of the guillotine, styled as a cold, geometrically perfect structure, Neoclassicism, looming over a tempestuous, emotionally charged sky, Romanticism. The base is stained with blood, betraying the machine's promise of humane science, presenting it as a false idol of enlightened progress, masking industrial political terror. Its stark lines contrasting with the swirling chaos below, Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. A desolate, highly symbolic landscape illustrating the unceremonious mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery. The scene must evoke the cold, unyielding finality of neoclassical tragedy, erasure of history, combined with the romantic melancholy of the earth consuming the queen's identity, symbolized by a single, discarded white ribbon half buried in the quicklime-dusted soil. A quiet tragedy far from the public spectacle, Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Focus on the visceral aftermath. The moment Sanson lifts the severed head by its shockingly white hair, only for the hair, slippery with blood, to cause the head to drop back into the basket with an audible, grotesque sound. Utilize the stripped, dramatic visual framing of Neoclassicism for the henchman's pose, juxtaposed against the raw, horrific, and immediately sensory detail of the visceral event, romantic horror. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. A diptych or split composition, contrasting the opulence of Marie Antoinette celebrating a fête at Versailles, neoclassical grandeur, Rococo flourishes, with her current state, confined to the dark, moldering conciergerie cell. The formal precision of the court setting must directly abut the emotional intensity and physical ruin depicted in the prison scene, emphasizing the sheer scope of her dramatic and absolute fall from grace. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. Capture the chilling, systematic efficiency of the rising reign of terror, symbolized by an endless, strictly ordered queue of condemned citizens marching toward the geometrically severe guillotine. The neoclassical emphasis on order and repetition highlights the industrialized murder, while the romantic element is supplied by the desperate, individual fear visible in the faces of the condemned under a blood-red dawn sky. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism. A neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, depiction of the former queen in the squalor of her conciergerie cell, where two guards perpetually watch her humiliation, emphasizing the stark contrast between her regal past and the louse-ridden present. A tableau of deliberate suffering designed to extinguish the flame of her classical dignity before the final act of terror. Her once golden hair, now shockingly white from deprivation, frames a face of profound, stoic resignation. Visualize the moment of ultimate judicial betrayal, rendered in the blended styles of neoclassicism and Romanticism, as the queen, though broken by weeks of torment, rises with the moral clarity of an antique heroine to rebut the vile, fabricated accusation of incest against her child. The sudden, terrible silence of the bloodthirsty revolutionary court, momentarily acknowledging the profound, inescapable horror of the lie, bathed in the severe, unforgiving light of revolutionary justice. An epic neoclassicism blended with Romanticism painting, capturing the torturous procession of the deposed monarch through the Parisian throng on the foul municipal tumbril, emphasizing the unnatural, agonizing fixation of her bound hands behind her back, forcing her elegant frame into a grotesque, oscillating posture of suffering against the vulgarity of the manure-stained wood. A calculated journey of public, sublime degradation that transforms the victim into a spectacle of political vengeance. Create a dramatic, romantic interpretation framed by neoclassical architectural severity of the throngs lining the Rue Saint-Honoré, their faces contorted into masks of vengeful ecstasy and base delight as they hurl filth and vitriol at the silent figure in the open cart, illustrating the terrifying, overwhelming power of the collective revolutionary id, a sublime torrent of human hatred engulfing the isolated, dignified stoicism of the victim. Portray the Queen's final, poignant moment on the blood-red scaffold, rendered in the high contrast of romanticism against the severe, ordered lines of the waiting guillotine, capturing the instant she whispers, "Pardon me, sir," after inadvertently stepping on the executioner's foot, a final, almost absurd adherence to aristocratic decorum amidst the apocalyptic clamor, cementing her tragic, isolated nobility in the face of inevitable, brutal demise. Illustrate the horrific climax of the execution, a neoclassicism blended with romanticism centered on the machinery of death, where the purported efficiency of the guillotine is betrayed by the blunt blade, demanding agonizing theatrical repetition, transforming the mechanism of enlightened execution into a shocking instrument of prolonged torture, highlighting the revolutionary hypocrisy and the mechanical horror descending upon the Queen's neck in a brutal, multi-stroke act of calculated cruelty. A neoclassicism blended with romanticism rendering of Jacques-Louis David observing and sketching the doomed queen from a cafe window as the cart passes, capturing the profound emptiness and terrible calm in her eyes, her roughly shorn white hair emphasizing the stark, stripped-down truth of her suffering, depicting not fear, but the complete, classical resignation of one who has surpassed all mortal affliction. Illustrate the horrific climax of the execution, a neoclassicism blended with romanticism scene focused on the machinery of death, where the purported efficiency of the guillotine is betrayed by the blunt blade, demanding agonizing theatrical repetition, transforming the mechanism of enlightened execution into a shocking instrument of prolonged torture, highlighting the revolutionary hypocrisy and the mechanical horror descending upon the Queen's neck in a brutal, multi-stroke act of calculated cruelty. A neoclassicism blended with romanticism rendering of Jacques-Louis David observing and sketching the doomed queen from a cafe window as the cart passes, capturing the profound emptiness and terrible calm in her eyes, her roughly shorn white hair emphasizing the stark, stripped-down truth of her suffering, depicting not fear, but the complete classical resignation of one who has surpassed all mortal affliction. A powerful neoclassicism blended with romanticism diptych, juxtaposing the former glory of Versailles, a vision of gilded, ordered splendor, with the 11 by 9-foot dungeon cell, emphasizing the extreme physical and psychological chasm traversed by the Queen, where her body, racked by untreated hemorrhage and deprivation, becomes a living ruin, a testament to the Revolution's merciless obliteration of inherited grandeur and dignity. Depict the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, in the severe, dramatic shadow and light of neoclassicism blended with romanticism, moments before the execution, his face registering a conflicted awareness of the political directive to maximize suffering by using a deliberately dulled blade, transforming his mandated role from judicial executioner to required participant in a ritualized, theatrical act of state-sanctioned, spectacular vengeance against the fallen monarchy. Visualize the gruesome climax on the Place de la Révolution, rendered in the intense, dramatic lighting of Romanticism set against the rigid neoclassical scaffold, where the executioner attempts to present the severed head, but the wet, white hair slips through his grasp, causing the head to fall back into the basket with a sickening sound, triggering not revulsion, but a cacophony of monstrous, celebratory, revolutionary applause. An intimate neoclassicism blended with Romanticism close-up, focusing on the rough stone wall of the conciergerie cell, showing the 76 tiny, desperate scratch marks of the fingernail calendar, symbolizing the Queen's final, ordered countdown toward inevitable fatality, a profound visual representation of the methodical erosion of hope and the disciplined counting of the days until freedom through death arrived. A compelling neoclassicism blended with Romanticism tableau, contrasting the enduring, cynical propaganda myth of the "let them eat cake" queen with the harrowing historical reality of her broken body and spirit, illustrating the revolution's systematic success in replacing the complex, suffering individual with a two-dimensional caricature, allowing their brutal, dehumanizing political terror to be falsely justified as necessary justice. A highly detailed neoclassical oil painting depicting the pre-dawn hours of October 16, 1793, inside Marie Antoinette's austere cell in the conciergerie, capture the stark romantic agony as the Queen, draped in shadowed linen, runs a trembling hand through her newly and completely whitened hair, symbolizing the ultimate corrosive triumph of systematic starvation and untreated suffering over royal flesh, emphasizing the profound silence before the ensuing storm of revolutionary malice and public exposure.
A dramatic, tenebrous representation in the style of David, capturing the procession of Marie Antoinette upon the ignominious, odoriferous open cart. The composition must juxtapose the broken dignity of the figure, tightly bound and swaying on the coarse straw, against the frenzied, monstrous exultation of the sans-culottes mob lining the Rue Saint-Honoré, highlighting the calculated, excruciating slowness of the journey which transforms the path to execution into a stage for relentless, premeditated public humiliation, a romantic fall from Olympian height. Sculpt a profound, emotionally charged depiction of the guillotine's final moment on the Place de la Révolution, focusing not on the gore but on the betrayal of the Enlightenment ideal. Show the massive, blood-red structure under a tempestuous sky, with revolutionary fervor contrasting sharply with the tragic realization of the victim that the descent of the intentionally dulled blade signifies not a humane end, but the agonizing continuation of the calculated torture, rendered with meticulous neoclassical attention to the machinery of injustice. A monumental romantic canvas illustrating the moment in the tribunal where Marie Antoinette confronts the monstrous incest accusation. The composition should centralize her figure, rising with sudden, terrible maternal anguish, appealing to the gallery of mothers, a sudden, powerful eruption of authentic human feeling that momentarily shatters the neoclassical severity of the rigged courtroom, using sharp contrasts of light and shadow to convey the moral obscenity of the fabricated charge designed for annihilation. A monumental romantic canvas illustrating the moment in the tribunal where Marie Antoinette confronts the monstrous incest accusation. The composition should centralize her figure, rising with sudden, terrible maternal anguish, appealing to the gallery of mothers, a sudden, powerful eruption of authentic human feeling that momentarily shatters the neoclassical severity of the rigged courtroom, using sharp contrasts of light and shadow to convey the moral obscenity of the fabricated charge designed for annihilation. A monumental romantic canvas illustrating the moment in the tribunal where Marie Antoinette confronts the monstrous incest accusation. The composition should centralize her figure, rising with sudden, terrible maternal anguish, appealing to the gallery of mothers, a sudden, powerful eruption of authentic human feeling that momentarily shatters the neoclassical severity of the rigged courtroom, using sharp contrasts of light and shadow to convey the moral obscenity of the fabricated charge designed for annihilation. A high-relief marble sculpture illustrating the final, ephemeral instant on the scaffold steps where Marie Antoinette utters, "Pardon me, sir," having stumbled upon the executioner's foot. This sculpture must embody the ultimate paradox of classical courtly grace clinging desperately to life amidst the romantic chaos of impending, violent death, emphasizing the dignity of strict etiquette triumphing over fear, with the frenzied mob a chaotic backdrop. A high-relief marble sculpture illustrating the final, ephemeral instant on the scaffold steps where Marie Antoinette utters, "Pardon me, sir," having stumbled upon the executioner's foot. This sculpture must embody the ultimate paradox of classical courtly grace clinging desperately to life amidst the romantic chaos of impending violent death, emphasizing the dignity of strict etiquette triumphing over fear, with the frenzied mob a chaotic backdrop.
A symmetrical, chilling interior scene showing the 11 by 10-foot conciergerie cell, meticulously rendered with neoclassical precision, revealing two revolutionary guards staring relentlessly at the queen, who attempts a moment of private dignity, hunched over the lone chamber pot. The pervasive, suffocating intrusion over 76 continuous days must be the central theme, conveying the romantic psychological terror of absolute, dehumanizing surveillance and the systematic erosion of the self. Illustrate the execution site as an altar to political vengeance, a high neoclassical perspective view of the Place de la Révolution, dominated by the crimson structure of the guillotine, framed by vengeful statues representing liberty and terror. The scene must capture the romantic idea that this event served not justice, but as a calculated, ritualized destruction intended to set a terrifying precedent for the ensuing reign of terror, marked by explosive public bloodlust. A diptych contrasting the Rococo splendor of Versailles' Hall of Mirrors, filled with gilded light and courtly figures, against the brutal, shadowed stone geometry of the conciergerie dungeon. The romantic tragedy lies in the absolute physical and symbolic chasm between these two realities, illustrating the shattering swiftness of the Queen's catastrophic descent from an icon of European luxury to a mere object awaiting erasure by the revolutionary machine. A somber, late Romantic landscape painting depicting the unhallowed mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, where quicklime consumes the body of the Queen alongside common prisoners. The composition must evoke the profound historical violation of denying burial dignity, symbolizing the revolutionary government's successful attempt at total narrative and physical eradication, leaving behind only the stark, desolate earth under a heavy, indifferent sky, far from any classical memorial. A deeply emotive, romantic depiction of the immediate aftermath on the scaffold, focusing on the moment the severed head, grasped by the executioner's blood-soaked hand, slips and falls back into the awaiting basket with a grotesque sound. Capture the macabre lack of reverence and the collective roaring applause of the 30,000 onlookers, highlighting the brutal efficiency of the political murder masquerading as classical societal purification through violence. Detail the agonizing hour and 12-minute procession down the Rue Saint-Honoré, rendered as a frieze of suffering and antagonism. Emphasize the historical tragedy of the Queen, physically unable to maintain balance due to her tightly bound hands and the rough cart, relentlessly mocked by the torrent of verbal abuse and physical missiles, rotten vegetables, mud, showing the calculated psychological warfare designed to extinguish all remnants of neoclassical composure before the final act.
A neoclassicism blended with romanticism painting, capturing Marie Antoinette in the Conciergerie, 16th October 1793, seated upon a lice-ridden mattress, her once golden, now stark white hair tumbling dramatically over her emaciated shoulders. The scene illuminated by a single, desperate shaft of moonlight filtering through an unseen grate, emphasizing the stark architectural severity of the 11 by 9 foot stone cell and the crushing weight of two constant, silent revolutionary guards standing like cruel statues, observing her final, agonizing descent into despair. An epic neoclassicism blended with romanticism courtroom scene, depicting the moment Marie Antoinette, worn down by 76 days of calculated deprivation, rises with a sudden, powerful surge of maternal indignation to address the public gallery during the incest accusation. The geometry of the revolutionary tribunal, stern and unforgiving, contrasted sharply by the horrified emotional chaos, romanticism, visible on the faces of the knitting women, tricotees, bathed in the cold, unforgiving light of false justice, highlighting the ultimate collapse of moral order. A dramatic neoclassicism blended with romanticism panorama of the Rue Saint-Honoré, 16th October 1793, focusing on the Queen, now stripped of all adornment, bound tightly upon a vile, open wooden refuse cart, the stench of its contents blending with the autumn air. The composition must emphasize the cruel, slow trajectory past the glorious, indifferent facade of the Tuileries Palace, contrasting the sublime memory of her past sovereignty with the savage, roaring mob that constitutes her current audience, all rendered in deep chiaroscuro. A neoclassicism blended with romanticism ink sketch, executed with the severe lines of David's revolutionary hand, capturing Marie Antoinette's face from the passing tumbril, emphasized the stark geometry of suffering, hollow eyes, the thin, resolute line of her mouth, set against the hastily and crudely shorn white hair, portraying profound stoicism, neoclassicism, battling overwhelming, internalized despair, romanticism, illustrating her as a tragic victim sacrificed upon the altar of political necessity, captured in the fleeting moment of her public transit. A neoclassicism blended with romanticism sculpture, rendering the final, poignant moment on the crimson scaffold steps of the Place de la Révolution, where Marie Antoinette, weakened by sickness and ordeal, stumbles and whispers, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose," to the executioner. The marble must capture the fragility of her posture, contrasted with the looming, geometric mass of the guillotine above, symbolizing the clash between inherent personal dignity and the brutal, overwhelming mechanism of the terror, under a sky heavy with impending doom. A neoclassicism blended with romanticism ink sketch, executed with the severe lines of David's revolutionary hand, capturing Marie Antoinette's face from the passing tumbril, emphasized the stark geometry of suffering, hollow eyes, the thin, resolute line of her mouth, set against the hastily and crudely shorn white hair, portraying profound stoicism, neoclassicism, battling overwhelming, internalized despair, romanticism, illustrating her as a tragic victim sacrificed upon the altar of political necessity, captured in the fleeting moment of her public transit. A neoclassicism blended with romanticism sculpture, rendering the final, poignant moment on the crimson scaffold steps of the Place de la Révolution, where Marie Antoinette, weakened by sickness and ordeal, stumbles and whispers, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose," to the executioner. The marble must capture the fragility of her posture, contrasted with the looming, geometric mass of the guillotine above, symbolizing the clash between inherent personal dignity and the brutal, overwhelming mechanism of the terror, under a sky heavy with impending doom.
A stark, dramatic illustration,
Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, focusing intimately on the mechanism of the guillotine's lunette at the moment of failure. Depict the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, grimacing slightly as the intentionally blunted blade, a scientific instrument perverted into a tool of prolonged theatrical torture, fails to sever the neck cleanly on the first descent, emphasizing the hideous, concealed truth of the humane revolution set against the shrieking, ecstatic crowd below, rendered through intense, high-contrast lighting. A neoclassicism blended with Romanticism photograph of a rough, cold stone wall in the conciergerie, starkly illuminated to reveal the delicate, desperate incisions of 76 fingernail markings. Marie Antoinette's final, private calendar counting down the days to her execution. The composition should contrast the timeless, brutal architecture of the prison with the fragile, intensely personal testament to suffering, evoking the immense mental fortitude required to track one's own impending, ritualized demise against the backdrop of political chaos. A deeply atmospheric neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, interior painting showing Marie Antoinette forced to change before two towering, impassive male guards. The setting is geometrically precise, emphasizing the cramped, ordered cruelty of the cell, while the light subtly draws attention to the humiliation and the forced loss of privacy, portraying her physical deterioration, the signs of untreated bleeding and anemia, as a calculated outcome of systematic, state-sponsored psychological destruction designed to break her spirit before the trial. A powerful neoclassicism blended with Romanticism tableau, showing the executioner hoisting Marie Antoinette's severed head, white hair stained crimson, to display to the jubilant, chaotic multitude. The neoclassical element defines the clean, central structure of the scaffold, while the romantic vision captures the frenzied, macabre delight of the 50,000 onlookers, rendering the scene as a grotesque victory procession. Emphasizing the horrifying moment the head briefly slips back into the waiting basket before being triumphantly lifted again, symbolizing the revolution's consumption of its own symbols. A double portrait, neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, showing the sharp, tragic dichotomy. On one side, Marie Antoinette, the resplendent Queen of Versailles, idealized and majestic. On the other, the broken prisoner of the conciergerie, her face gaunt, her white hair brutally shorn, the rough hemp restraints around her wrists visible, juxtaposing the glorious, ordered past with the brutal, chaotic reality of her final hours, highlighting the calculated effort to erase her former majesty through maximum public ignominy.
A somber neoclassicism blended with Romanticism depiction of the unceremonious burial at the Madeleine Cemetery. The scene should be dark, featuring the hasty deposition of Marie Antoinette's body into a shallow, unmarked mass grave alongside common criminals, focusing on the dehumanizing act of shoveling quicklime over the remains to ensure rapid erasure, symbolizing the revolutionary's ultimate goal of annihilating her historical existence and memory, a profound tragedy rendered with quiet, chilling formality. A conceptual neoclassicism blended with Romanticism artwork presenting the guillotine. The apparatus is rendered with perfect neoclassical symmetry and cold, rational geometry, symbolizing the proclaimed ideals of scientific humanism. But the romantic element introduces bloodied, rough-hewn details and subtle cracks in the platform, revealing the underlying lie that the revolution marketed: a facade of mercy masking systematic, calculated political vengeance and prolonged suffering, echoing the brutal start of the terror's statistical machine. a profoundly melancholic depiction, rendered in the blended style of neoclassicism and romanticism, showing Marie Antoinette in the stark, damp confinement of her conciergerie cell, 70 days into her incarceration. Her once elaborate hair is now purely white, starkly contrasting with the shadowed stone walls. A single, dramatic ray of moonlight penetrates the high window, illuminating her figure as she traces the calendar marks into the cold, unforgiving surface with a broken fingernail, symbolizing the slow, calculated erosion of her humanity and dignity before the ultimate tragedy. A historical tableau vivant, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, capturing the execution procession on October 16, 1793. Marie Antoinette, clad in a simple white shift, is seated rigidly upon the manure cart, her hands tightly bound behind her back in an agonizing pose. The scene is enveloped in the dramatic chiaroscuro of a tragic destiny, juxtaposing the sublime dignity of her suffering against the savage, spitting frenzy of the revolutionary mob lining the Rue Saint-Honoré, emphasizing the calculated public degradation designed to annihilate her royal spirit. A monumental romantic composition featuring Marie Antoinette ascending the scaffold steps on the Place de la Révolution. Her pale, attenuated form momentarily stumbles, her bare foot accidentally meeting the boot of the grim executioner, Charles Henry Sanson. Render this moment of profound, painful irony with the severe grace of neoclassicism, focusing on the whisper of her final, instinctive apology, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," a desperate, quiet plea for propriety against the monumental, blood-red backdrop of the guillotine and the cyclonic fury of the surrounding baying crowd.
Illustrate the climax of the travesty of justice in the courtroom, October 14, 1993, utilizing the harsh architectural lines of neoclassicism to frame the intense emotional outburst characteristic of Romanticism. Marie Antoinette rises with broken composure, addressing the public gallery after the monstrous incest accusation involving her son. The scene must depict the sudden, stunned silence of the tricotesses and the revolutionary jurors, her face a mask of sublime maternal grief and outraged innocence, emphasizing the calculated psychological destruction preceding her condemnation. A somber, deeply introspective portrait, inspired by the style of Jacques-Louis David but imbued with romantic melancholy, showing Marie Antoinette during the endless court procession. Her eyes are hollow and distant, the resignation absolute, the hastily and crudely shorn white hair visible beneath her cap. The composition should use the severe lines of the revolutionary setting, soldiers, pikes, to contrast with the profound, isolated despair etched onto her face, reflecting the moment of spiritual extinguishment before the physical death decreed by the revolution's calculated cruelty. Render the crimson, towering scaffold and the guillotine apparatus on the Place de la Révolution, depicted with the cold, unforgiving geometry of neoclassicism. The romantic element is the palpable sense of dread and the hidden tragedy, an immediate, visceral depiction of the moment the intentionally blunted blade strikes, requiring a second descent, a deliberate act of prolonged torture masked by the revolution's veneer of enlightened execution. Capture the grotesque juxtaposition of mechanical efficiency and calculated, agonizing failure witnessed by the tens of thousands of cheering spectators. Create a highly detailed, severe interior scene of the conciergerie cell, 11 by 9 feet, employing the strict architectural rules of neoclassicism. The romantic tension arises from the constant, humiliating presence of the two male revolutionary guards observing the former queen. She stands by the straw-covered pallet, attempting to dress, her posture radiating profound, violated dignity and exhaustion, capturing the systematic psychological warfare designed to strip her of all selfhood over 76 days of unending, invasive scrutiny. A dramatic, emotionally charged depiction of the preliminary humiliation inside the conciergerie cell on the morning of execution, executed in the blended style. The massive figure of the executioner, Sanson, dominates the frame, holding a brutal pair of shears as he roughly severs Marie Antoinette's now entirely white, brittle hair, the first public act of symbolic destruction. The scene utilizes deep, romantic shadows to convey the inherent violation and the stark, cruel finality of this moment, which precedes her final, agonizing journey to the scaffold. Render the crimson, towering scaffold and the guillotine apparatus on the Place de la Révolution, depicted with the cold, unforgiving geometry of neoclassicism. The romantic element is the palpable sense of dread and the hidden tragedy, an immediate, visceral depiction of the moment the intentionally blunted blade strikes, requiring a second descent, a deliberate act of prolonged torture masked by the revolution's veneer of enlightened execution. Capture the grotesque juxtaposition of mechanical efficiency and calculated, agonizing failure, witnessed by the tens of thousands of cheering spectators. Create a highly detailed, severe interior scene of the conciergerie cell, 11 by 9 feet, employing the strict architectural rules of neoclassicism. The romantic tension arises from the constant, humiliating presence of the two male revolutionary guards observing the former queen. She stands by the straw-covered pallet, attempting to dress, her posture radiating profound, violated dignity and exhaustion, capturing the systematic psychological warfare designed to strip her of all selfhood over 76 days of unending, invasive scrutiny. A dramatic, emotionally charged depiction of the preliminary humiliation inside the conciergerie cell on the morning of execution, executed in the blended style. The massive figure of the executioner, Sanson, dominates the frame, holding a brutal pair of shears as he roughly severs Marie Antoinette's now entirely white, brittle hair, the first public act of symbolic destruction. The scene utilizes deep, romantic shadows to convey the inherent violation and the stark, cruel finality of this moment, which precedes her final, agonizing journey to the scaffold.
A desolate and chilling post-execution scene, rendered with the sublime melancholy of high romanticism, framed by the stark, severe simplicity of the Madeleine Cemetery. Show an unadorned, freshly dug mass grave, a pit of lime and earth into which the body of the former queen has been unceremoniously dumped, symbolizing the revolution's intent for total historical obliteration. The composition should evoke a sense of profound injustice and absolute finality, contrasting the grand scale of her former life with the squalor of her anonymous resting place, a calculated act of ultimate dehumanization. Focus intimately on the physical torture during the slow, protracted cart journey, rendered with the tragic realism of neoclassicism blended with the emotive intensity of romanticism. Detail the rough hemp rope cutting deeply into Marie Antoinette's emaciated wrists, binding her hands unnaturally behind her back, causing her body to sway violently and precariously on the uneven stone streets. The lighting should emphasize the pale, bruised skin against the coarse rope, highlighting the deliberate cruelty of the position designed to maximize her visible, painful struggle for balance before the jeering masses. A panoramic, dramatic vista of the Place de la Révolution, employing the strong, balanced composition of neoclassicism to anchor the terrifying chaos of romantic spectacle. The bright, sharp geometry of the towering, blood-red guillotine dominates the center, surrounded by an overwhelming, surging ocean of 30,000 screaming revolutionary citizens, consuming the tragic moment. The scene must emphasize the transition from the concept of enlightened justice to industrial, ritualized political murder and public entertainment, viewed under a heavy, fateful sky. An intensely private and sorrowful scene, painted with the high pathos of romanticism, but contained within the rigid, unyielding confines of the conciergerie cell, neoclassic setting. Marie Antoinette, severely weakened by anemia and deprivations, leans against the stone wall. Her eyes are fixed on the tiny, fragile scratches, the 76 tally marks she carved into the stone with her fingernail. A silent, desperate countdown to her inevitable fate, symbolizing the profound endurance of the human spirit measured against the overwhelming, systemic oppression of the revolutionary state. A solemn, candle-lit depiction of the conciergerie cell, 11 by 9 feet, where Marie Antoinette, robed in simple, tattered linen, sits upon a straw pallet, her once golden hair turned irrevocably white by 76 days of relentless psychological torment and physical deprivations. 2 revolutionary guards, rendered in harsh, realistic detail, stand sentinel, observing her every movement, a stark commentary on the destruction of aristocratic dignity by the implacable gaze of the new republic, executed in the blended style of neoclassicism and dramatic romantic chiaroscuro.
The tragic journey of the former sovereign through the thronged streets of Paris, mounted upon the common dung cart, a grotesque distortion of a royal carriage. Her hands are bound behind her back with cruel tightness, forcing a posture of excruciating vulnerability against the cobblestones, while a raging, expressionistic mob, rendered with romantic fervor, hurls invective and debris, transforming the Rue Saint-Honoré into an amphitheater of vengeful populist theater, captured with the formal composition of neoclassicism, contrasting with the passionate chaos of the scene. A poignant, full-length portrait, styled after formal neoclassical drawing but imbued with romantic pathos, capturing Marie Antoinette during her final procession. Her face, etched with profound exhaustion and dignity, wears a mask of detached resignation, the roughly shorn, prematurely white hair starkly framing her features, emphasizing the catastrophic contrast between her former splendor and her current ruin, a symbol of sovereign suffering under the cruel gaze of an unforgiving, revolutionary populace, rendered with muted, tragic color tones. A sprawling, historically detailed tableau depicting the revolutionary tribunal within the Palais de Justice, rendered with the weighty seriousness of neoclassical history painting. The Queen stands isolated, facing the monstrous accusation of incest, the moment where even the tricoteuses cease their work, captured with intense romantic lighting that illuminates her face in a spotlight of agonizing moral clarity, contrasting her isolated, stoic dignity against the manipulative shadow cast by the implacable prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, a scene of judicial barbarity disguised as civic order. A climactic composition featuring the massive crimson-painted scaffold on the Place de la Révolution, executed with neoclassical symmetry. The Queen, weakened and staggering, pauses, having just stumbled on the steps, her gaze fixed on the executioner's boot, whispering her final, civilized apology. "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur." An ultimate, pathetic gesture of old-world etiquette colliding dramatically with the monstrous machinery of revolutionary terror, rendered with sweeping romantic energy and an overwhelming sense of the sublime tragedy of her end. A fiercely dramatic depiction of the guillotine, styled as a metallic, implacable god of the new age, its massive structure looming over the screaming populace. The scene is frozen at the moment of the incomplete execution, emphasizing the horrifying betrayal of the promise of humane death, as the intentionally dulled blade fails, requiring a second agonizing descent. A purely romantic vision of industrialized suffering and calculated malice, where the cold, formal lines of the neoclassical machine are stained by the heat of revolutionary bloodlust. A fiercely dramatic depiction of the guillotine, styled as a metallic, implacable god of the new age, its massive structure looming over the screaming populace. The scene is frozen at the moment of the incomplete execution, emphasizing the horrifying betrayal of the promise of humane death, as the intentionally dulled blade fails, requiring a second agonizing descent. A purely romantic vision of industrialized suffering and calculated malice, where the cold, formal lines of the neoclassical machine are stained by the heat of revolutionary bloodlust.
A close-up, intensely focused study, reminiscent of a romantic still life or architectural detail, showing the rough, damp stone of the conciergerie wall. Dimly illuminated by a weak light source, the viewer discovers a series of delicate, desperate markings, the by 76 tally scratches of Marie Antoinette's final days, etched into the cold masonry by her fingernail, symbolizing the slow, deliberate erosion of her existence and her final countdown towards the rendezvous with the executioner's platform. A profound neoclassical meditation on time, fate, and irreversible doom. A horrifying, high-contrast romantic scene on the scaffold, centered on the figure of the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, standing defiant against the roaring crowd. He attempts to display the freshly severed head of the queen, recognizable by its wet, stark white hair, but the head slips tragically from his blood-soaked grasp, plummeting back into the basket with a sickening thud. A final, unscripted act of complete dehumanization and ignominy witnessed by 50,000 frenzied spectators, captured with the lurid colors and emotional intensity typical of romantic tragedy. A vast panoramic composition utilizing neoclassical structure to organize the chaotic energy of the French revolutionary crowd, numbering 30,000 souls. The focal point is the isolated, vulnerable queen traversing the hostile sea of faces, subjected to a barrage of insults, refuse, and visceral hatred. Illustrating the concept of political vengeance replacing justice, rendered with the dramatic foreshortening and fervent emotionalism of romanticism, highlighting the terrifying, sublime power of the collective, unreasoning populace. A dark, minimalist scene depicting the newly filled, unmarked mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery. The ground is sparsely covered with quicklime, symbolizing the revolutionary government's systematic attempt to chemically and historically obliterate the very existence of the former queen, contrasting the grandeur of her former life with the grim, anonymous finality of her burial. A quiet, profound neoclassical reflection on mortality and the ultimate futility of earthly power, steeped in the melancholic atmosphere of romantic fatalism. A powerful, allegorical composition blending the formal portraiture of neoclassicism with the chaotic energy of revolutionary print. The dignified, suffering face of Marie Antoinette is partially obscured by fluttering, crudely printed pamphlets and broadsheets, symbolizing the calculated destruction of her reputation through manufactured political lies, particularly the infamous fabricated quote about cake, representing the triumph of cynical propaganda over historical truth and the systemic moral corruption inherent in political terror and engineered public hatred. A high-angle, intensely stylized image of the Place de la Révolution moments after the execution, focusing on a single, ceremonial crimson pool of blood around the base of the guillotine, symbolizing not just Marie Antoinette's demise, but the tragic, inexorable inception of the Reign of Terror and the ensuing slaughter of 16,594 French citizens. The composition is strictly neoclassical, while the overwhelming psychological weight and the sense of doom are purely romantic, depicting the bloody foundation upon which the industrial mechanism of political murder was established.
Envision a neoclassical portrait of Marie Antoinette in the dim confines of the Conciergerie, her face sculpted by stoic resignation, yet her prematurely whitened hair cascading like snow against the stark, rough-hewn stone of her cell wall emphasizes the sublime horror of 76 days of calculated psychological torment and physical deprivation, rendered with dramatic chiaroscuro lighting typical of romantic tragedy. Illustrate the agonizing climax of the Revolutionary Tribunal, where the dignity of neoclassical justice is shattered by the vile, manufactured accusation of incest. Focus on Marie Antoinette standing defiant, appealing to the universal bond of motherhood against the bloodthirsty, chaotic, romantic fervor of the court, emphasizing the stark emotional contrast between her rigid pose and the palpable moral corruption engulfing the scene under the pallid light of false judgment. A dramatic romantic scene depicting the final agonizing transit of the former queen upon the common manure cart, contrasting the neoclassical ideal of a dignified procession with the horrifying reality of public scorn. Capture the visceral detail of the rough ropes binding her wrists and the visible odor of the vehicle as she navigates the shrieking, chaotic mob lining the Rue Saint-Honoré, her gaze fixed on a distant, unattainable horizon of memory. Generate an image of the infamous guillotine on the Place de la Révolution, presented as a coldly efficient neoclassical machine of statecraft, yet subtly corrupted by the romantic horror of its purpose. The scene must emphasize the calculated cruelty symbolized by the deliberately dull blade hanging menacingly above the waiting populace, suggesting the agonizing, non-instantaneous demise that betrayed the revolutionary promise of humane execution. Portray the penultimate moment on the blood-soaked, red-painted scaffold, focusing on the rigid, neoclassical formality of Marie Antoinette's final, whispered apology to the executioner for having stepped upon his foot, juxtaposed against the overwhelming, chaotic, romantic energy of the 50,000 screaming spectators and the immense, terrifying presence of the deadly awaiting mechanism, capturing a fleeting moment of lost human grace.
Create a highly atmospheric illustration showing Marie Antoinette in her confined conciergerie cell, dominated by the unflinching, watchful eyes of two male revolutionary guards. The composition should employ intense romantic shadow and light to convey the suffocating psychological cruelty of perpetual observation and the systematic destruction of privacy and dignity, setting a scene of stoic endurance against unrelenting political degradation. Illustrate Jacques-Louis David, the neoclassical painter, sketching the passing queen from a cafe window, capturing Marie Antoinette's face in a moment of profound, vacant resignation, her roughly shorn white hair visible. The romantic element must be the overwhelming sense of doom and the chilling objectivity of the artist documenting a ritualized political murder intended to serve as a terrifying, didactic symbol for all aristocratic Europe. A profoundly disturbing romantic tableau capturing the precise moment the executioner, his hands slick with gore, struggles to lift the queen's severed head by the remaining white locks, emphasizing the horrifying detail of the head slipping and falling back into the basket. Render the cacophony of the jubilant, chaotic mob in the background, contrasting the fleeting, dignified neoclassical composure of the deceased with the brutal, visceral reality of the spectacle. Design a stark neoclassical propaganda poster depicting a grotesque, smiling Marie Antoinette declaring the fabricated "let them eat cake" quote, contrasting this manufactured image with a small, haunting, romantic inset showing the real woman, gaunt and broken, carving 76 marks into the stone wall of her dungeon cell, highlighting the systematic psychological process of transforming a flawed human into a necessary public villain. Detail a poignant, intimate, neoclassical depiction of the queen after 50 days of imprisonment, her body weakened by severe, untreated hemorrhaging and starvation,
emphasizing the fragile, near-spectral appearance of a woman sustained only by fierce internal dignity. Use the romantic context to emphasize the cruel indifference of the revolutionary government, viewing her physical failure as a welcomed precursor to their ultimate goal of public annihilation. A melancholic, subdued romantic landscape showing the unceremonious mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, where the body of the former queen, unacknowledged and covered with quicklime, is carelessly discarded alongside common criminals. The scene should be rendered with neoclassical sobriety, emphasizing the complete and systematic erasure of dignity, marking the ultimate failure of humanity in the pursuit of political revenge.
Generate a sweeping, dramatic, romantic scene illustrating the immediate aftermath of the execution, where the single act of judicial murder transforms into the industrial machinery of the Reign of Terror, symbolized by an unending line of anonymous, doomed citizens marching toward the ubiquitous guillotine. Contrast this with the fallen neoclassical ideals of the Enlightenment, now corrupted into tools for mass political extermination and fear. A highly detailed, solemn neoclassical portrait blended with romantic despair, depicting Marie Antoinette in the squalor of her conciergerie cell on the morning of her execution, her once golden hair now utterly white from suffering and deprivation, rendered with dramatic chiaroscuro, emphasizing the monumental tragedy of her broken spirit against the rough-hewn stone walls, a stark testament to the failure of royal fate amidst revolutionary fervor. Illustrate the agonizing procession of Marie Antoinette upon the open, common refuse cart, chariot de merde, through the densely packed, hostile Parisian streets, capturing the romantic sublime horror of the moment, where former sovereign dignity is violently extinguished, using a formal composition reminiscent of classical tragedy, where the pale figure is bound and exposed beneath a tempestuous sky, watched by the frenzied, monumental crowd of revolutionary zealots along the Rue Saint-Honoré. A painting in the neoclassical tradition of historical tragedy, focusing on the moment of the incest accusation during the 16-hour trial, showing Marie Antoinette rising with agonizing dignity in the courtroom, the Tribunal Révolutionnaire, the scene lit harshly to reveal the calculated cruelty of Fouquier Tinville and the momentary, horrified silence of the tricoteuse, emphasizing the moral ruin and the absolute corruption of virtue disguised as revolutionary justice. Envision a dark, romantic interpretation of the final moments at the Place de la Révolution, focusing not on the execution itself, but the immediate aftermath of the first failed attempt. The sharp, sudden jolt of the guillotine blade catching, symbolized by a spectral light illuminating the mechanism and the executioner's grim solemnity, capturing the profound betrayal of the machine's promised humanity and the ensuing, deliberate, protracted agony. A melancholic, detailed neoclassical study, executed in the manner of Jacques-Louis David, but imbued with romantic pathos, capturing the precise, spectral image of Marie Antoinette as she passes his window on the tumbrel, her features gaunt and resigned, her roughly shorn white hair visible, focusing on the profound solitude of the condemned figure against the vast, unforgiving architectural facade of revolutionary Paris. Depict the instant Marie Antoinette stumbles upon the steps of the scaffold and utters her final, quiet apology. Pardonnez-moi, monsieur, je ne l'ai pas fait exprès.
An ultimate neoclassical gesture of etiquette and virtue, collapsing under the weight of romantic, overwhelming public humiliation, emphasizing the stark contrast between her internal, controlled dignity and the monumental, blood-red platform of revolutionary death. An intimate yet brutally structured interior scene of the conciergerie cell, 11 by 9 feet,
adhering to neoclassical principles of composition while evoking the pervasive sense of romantic psychological horror, depicting two revolutionary guards perpetually watching the queen as she attempts a moment of private repose or necessity, symbolizing the 76 days of calculated erasure of her human dignity and privacy. A poignant, almost monochromatic romantic scene depicting the aftermath, the unmarked mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, where Marie Antoinette's body, covered in quicklime, is being buried alongside common criminals, a chilling neoclassical meditation on the ultimate destruction of royal grandeur and the systematic intent of the revolution to erase every physical trace of her existence from history. A monumental diptych contrasting the Rococo splendor and light of Versailles, neoclassical ideal of luxury, with the damp, pestilent darkness of the conciergerie, ruin and decay, using stark symbolic contrast to illustrate the dizzying, devastating fall from absolute power to absolute destitution in the span of 76 days, emphasizing the catastrophic weight of fate. A powerful allegorical representation where the guillotine stands as a sinister, blood-stained altar of false enlightened justice, its stark, geometric neoclassical design betraying the hidden romantic horror of its purpose, the dull blade, the repeated blows, emphasizing the machine as the central terrifying symbol of industrialized political murder and revolutionary deception. A solemn, detail-focused close-up of the tiny calendar Marie Antoinette scratched into the stone wall of her cell using her fingernail, 76 desperate marks counting down to the final day, rendered with the precise, tragic clarity of neoclassicism, but evoking the deep personal terror and mental collapse characteristic of romantic distress and solitude. Capture the dramatic final moment when the executioner holds up the severed head of Marie Antoinette by her newly whitened hair to the screaming, monumental crowd. A visceral, high-contrast romantic scene of macabre triumph, framed by the rigid, formal structure of the guillotine platform, illustrating the gruesome consumption of her suffering by the revolutionary populace.
Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism depiction of Marie Antoinette in the conciergerie cell 76 days into her confinement, emphasized the stark, cold stone architecture typical of classical prison design, contrasting sharply with the chaotic, wild cascade of her suddenly whitened hair, illuminated by a single, dramatic shaft of moonlight penetrating the high window, symbolizing the swift, destructive force of revolutionary despair and psychological warfare, demanding profound pathos and historical gravity. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism illustration of the revolutionary tribunal, the cold, imposing marble and oak of the courtroom architecture framing the deeply distressing moment when the accusation of incest is levied. Capture the horrified silence of the onlookers and the queen's transcendent, anguished appeal to the mother's present, rendered in dramatic chiaroscuro to highlight the moral darkness consuming the false pursuit of justice during this organized judicial terror. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism painting, capturing the deliberate, agonizing procession of Marie Antoinette upon the foul, open scavenger's cart through the Rue Saint-Honoré, her posture rigid yet contorted by tightly bound ropes. The scene must combine the clarity of classical street architecture with the frenzied, dark, emotional tide of the 30,000 screaming citizens, focusing on the Queen's profound, detached resignation against the backdrop of sublime revolutionary rage. A symbolic neoclassicism blended with Romanticism view, mirroring the detailed observation of Jacques-Louis David's captured moment,
Marie Antoinette seated on the ignoble cart, her features starkly defined by suffering and total internal surrender, her rough-cut white hair catching the autumn sun. The composition should emphasize the stark geometry of the Revolutionary Guards and the guillotine looming in the distance, representing inescapable fate, rendered with the emotional intensity of a historical tragedy. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, painting capturing the scaffold steps on the Place de la Révolution. The scene focuses on the Queen's final, almost invisible act of human dignity, the whispered apology to the executioner after stumbling, set against the colossal, blood-red structure of the guillotine and the cyclonic, chaotic energy of the surrounding revolutionary mob, utilizing deep shadows and heroic scale to elevate the moment of ultimate humiliation into an act of tragic nobility. A symbolic neoclassicism blended with Romanticism representation of the guillotine, where the cold, mathematically precise lines of the machine contrast with the hidden, morally decaying truth of the deliberately dulled blade. Depict the apparatus under a stormy sky, emphasizing the dramatic irony of its supposed humanity versus its actual role as an instrument of prolonged, calculated political torture. A classical facade masking romantic terror.
Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, close up, focusing on Marie Antoinette's emaciated hands, bound tightly and unnaturally behind her back by coarse hemp rope within the confines of the open cart. The rendering must capture the pathos of her vulnerable wrists against the brutal texture of the rope, symbolizing the complete erasure of royal grace and the calculated physical torture designed to deny her even the ability to stand steadily before the jeering masses. A dark neoclassicism blended with Romanticism visual narrative capturing the moment the executioner raises Marie Antoinette's severed head to the cheering crowd on the Place de la Révolution. But the composition focuses on the horrifying reality of the subsequent accidental drop back into the basket. Employ high contrast and deep expressionistic shadows to convey the macabre spectacle and the crowd's overwhelming, bloodthirsty euphoria contrasted with the rigid, solemn setting of the square. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism depiction inside the cramped, fetid conciergerie cell 11 by 9 feet, where two muscular revolutionary guards stand perpetually watching the Queen. The composition must evoke the oppressive, claustrophobic psychological warfare, using stark neoclassical lines for the stone walls, but infusing the scene with the romantic terror of absolute loss of privacy and dignity, focusing on the Queen's averted gaze and profound exhaustion. An intensely detailed neoclassicism blended with Romanticism rendering of the stone wall within Marie Antoinette's cell, focusing on the small, desperate calendar she scratched with her fingernail. 76 tiny markings counting down to the preordained death. The lighting should be dramatic and melancholic, casting sharp shadows across the rough stone, emphasizing the isolated tragedy of a former monarch reduced to this fragile, defiant act of marking time toward annihilation. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism dual portrait. One side showing the idealized, propagandistic, revolutionary image of Marie Antoinette as the cake-eating tyrant, classical caricature, harshly contrasted with the other side, showing the anemic, white-haired reality of her suffering on the execution cart, romantic pathos. The entire piece should comment on the systematic destruction of humanity through political fiction and terror, rendered in a sharp, allegorical style. A somber, dramatic neoclassicism blended with Romanticism scene depicting the unceremonious mass burial of Marie Antoinette's body in the Madeleine Cemetery, emphasizing the indignity of quicklime being poured over her remains alongside common criminals. The scene should utilize the stark geometry of the open grave against a low, dark, romantic sky, symbolizing the revolutionary attempt to chemically and historically erase all trace of her existence and nobility, transforming her into a fearful footnote. A somber, dramatic neoclassicism blended with romanticism scene depicting the unceremonious mass burial of Marie Antoinette's body in the Madeleine Cemetery, emphasizing the indignity of quicklime being poured over her remains alongside common criminals. The scene should utilize the stark geometry of the open grave against a low, dark, romantic sky, symbolizing the revolutionary attempt to chemically and historically erase all trace of her existence and nobility, transforming her into a fearful footnote.
Create an oil painting in the style of neoclassicism blended with romanticism, depicting Marie Antoinette in the dim stone confines of the Conciergerie prison, her once golden hair now a shocking, luminous white mane, cascading over her threadbare gown, symbolizing the cumulative psychological and physical ravages of 76 days of calculated deprivation, illustrating the tragic speed with which systematic cruelty can obliterate regal splendor and vital color. The composition must evoke profound, silent suffering against a backdrop of severe architectural austerity. Visualize a dramatic high-contrast etching, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, illustrating the Queen's final, agonizing procession on the refuse cart through the frenzied Rue Saint-Honoré. The scene must capture the profound public degradation, with screaming crowds and architectural severity contrasting sharply with the agonizing dignity of the woman bound and exposed upon the humble, stench-ridden tumbrel, embodying the ritualized political revenge designed to crush her spirit before the fatal moment. Generate a dramatic chiaroscuro scene, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, focusing on the moment in the revolutionary tribunal where the false accusation of incest is levied. Capture the horrified silence of the tricoteuses and the Queen's sublime, heartbreaking appeal to all mothers present, emphasizing the colossal emotional weight of this judicial atrocity against the cold, unfeeling marble columns of the revolutionary courtroom, stressing the ultimate violation of maternal sanctity. Imagine a powerfully symbolic painting, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, showing the gleaming heavy guillotine blade poised above the lunette, but with a subtle implication of its dullness and the impending double strike, reflecting the ultimate betrayal of enlightened ideals. The focus should be on the theatrical, blood-red platform, contrasting with the solemn gray sky and the tragic realization that humane death was merely a veneer for engineered, prolonged torture and public spectacle. Design a claustrophobic interior study, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, of the 11 by 9 foot cell in the Conciergerie, perpetually illuminated by the intrusive presence of 2 male guards, detailing the absolute, systematic erosion of the Queen's privacy and dignity over the 76-day ordeal. The composition must emphasize the psychological torment inflicted by unblinking surveillance and forced exposure within the severe, timeless geometry of the medieval dungeon, highlighting her profound isolation. Render a highly emotional, yet formally composed sculpture illustration, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, capturing Marie Antoinette's final, profound gesture on the scaffold, her accidental step upon the executioner's foot, and her whispered, regal, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur." This moment of entrenched etiquette amidst ultimate horror should dominate the frame, juxtaposing sublime personal grace against the massive, brutal engine of the revolutionary state, signifying the last vestige of her former world. Create a chilling, melancholic portrait study, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, inspired by Jacques-Louis David's actual sketch, detailing the queen's profoundly resigned expression on the tumbrel. The artwork must focus on her hollow eyes and firmly set mouth, depicting a soul already departed from the body, illustrating the final, devastating emptiness achieved by the revolution's systematic psychological campaign of dehumanization through constant humiliation and suffering. Develop a dual-paneled masterpiece, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, contrasting the popular propagandistic caricature of Marie Antoinette, opulence, the fabricated cake quote, with the stark reality of her emaciated, white-haired figure bound for the guillotine. The composition must highlight the tragic gap between political fiction, used to justify immense brutality, and the true, brutal circumstances of her systematic destruction as a human being. Illustrate an allegorical scene, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, depicting the moment of Marie Antoinette's beheading as a dark initiation ritual, where the spilled royal blood visually marks the true, terrifying commencement of the ensuing reign of terror. The backdrop should feature ominous, stylized clouds descending upon the revolutionary mob, and the symbolic forging of the industrial murder machine, fueled by political vengeance and systemic erasure. Visualize a haunting, somber scene, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, of the anonymous burial site in the Madeleine Cemetery, emphasizing the indignity of quicklime being poured over the former queen's body alongside common prisoners. The atmosphere must be heavy with finality and the complete erasure of identity, contrasting the monumental tragedy of her life with the utterly base simplicity of her final resting place, underscoring the revolutionary goal of total obliteration. Produce a dark, intense psychological study, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, illustrating the use of forced exposure, controlled starvation, and cruel reminders of her children's clothes to systematically break Marie Antoinette's mental fortitude during her 76 days of imprisonment. The focus must be on the internal collapse of a sovereign mind under relentless, calculated oppression within the ancient walls of the prison, emphasizing the deliberate targeting of her maternal instincts.
Design an architectural and philosophical commentary, neoclassicism blended with romanticism, highlighting the cynical irony of the guillotine, a supposedly enlightened scientific instrument being utilized specifically for vengeful, prolonged cruelty, evidenced by the blunt blade and the public spectacle. Contrast the elegant geometry of the device with the barbaric passion of the surrounding revolutionary populace and the betrayal of true progress and human dignity. A dramatic chiaroscuro painting in the style of David, depicting Marie Antoinette in the stark, damp stone cell of the conciergerie 76 days into her torment. Her once golden hair, now a shocking cascade of pure white, contrasts violently with the shadow-drenched medieval architecture. She is etching the final mark of her calendar onto the rough stone wall with a desperate fingernail, embodying the silent endurance of a classical martyr against overwhelming revolutionary cruelty, emphasizing her tragic isolation and physical decay amidst cold, austere structures. An oil painting capturing the agonizing, slow procession of Marie Antoinette upon the filth-laden dung cart through the Rue Saint-Honoré, rendered with the dramatic intensity and emotional fervor of romanticism. The scene is framed by severe neoclassical facades, highlighting the juxtaposition of aristocratic ruin against revolutionary fervor. Her hands are cruelly bound behind her back, forcing a posture of agonizing vulnerability, as the seething, grotesque faces of the 30,000 onlookers surge forward, their cruelty a sublime wave of societal rage, illuminated by a harsh, unforgiving autumn light. A highly theatrical rendering of the trial scene, mimicking a grand historical tableau like those of Ingres, focusing on the moment Marie Antoinette stands to address the mothers in the gallery after the monstrous incest accusation. Her face, etched with profound sorrow and indignant purity, is a beacon of tragic virtue amidst the chaotic, darkly shadowed tribunal. The architecture is severely neoclassical, underscoring the legal formality corrupted by political malice, creating a powerful emotional climax where maternal dignity clashes violently with engineered depravity. A profoundly disturbing, epic canvas depicting the guillotine at the Place de la Révolution, not as a symbol of swift justice, but as a monument to broken Enlightenment ideals. The scaffold is painted in vivid, horrific crimson. Focus on the moment immediately after the first, incomplete impact of the deliberately dulled blade, emphasizing the agony and the betrayal of the promised humane death, transforming the classical symmetry of the device into an engine of barbaric torture, watched by a roaring, consuming multitude under a turbulent, expressive sky. A powerful, intensely dramatic depiction of the aftermath on the blood-soaked scaffold, rendered with the graphic precision of a historical tragedy.
Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, stands silhouetted against a pale sky, grasping the severed head, whose shocking white hair is slipping through his blood-soaked gloves, causing it to drop back into the basket with an audible, disgusting thud. The neoclassical architecture of the surrounding buildings provides a cold, immutable backdrop to this moment of absolute, ritualized public annihilation, capturing the profound emptiness of the political vengeance achieved. A melancholy romantic landscape where the spectral memory of Marie Antoinette's extravagant court, featuring elegant figures in silks and powdered wigs, is superimposed translucently over the grim reality of her final journey. The scene shows her seated rigidly on the crude, slow-moving cart, her gaze fixed yet distant, passing the Tuileries Palace, now a stark, ruined monument to revolution. This blend of phantom glory and immediate, agonizing reality captures the sublime tragedy of a life utterly extinguished by historical forces. An interior scene rendered with deep shadows and minimal light, focusing on the suffocating proximity of the two revolutionary guards stationed perpetually within Marie Antoinette's small cell. The tension is palpable, a study in psychological suffocation and invasion of privacy, executed with the emotional weight and chiaroscura mastery of Goya. The Queen attempts to maintain a semblance of regal composure while being forced to perform private acts before her sneering male observers, illustrating the calculated destruction of her dignity, cell by cell, over the 76 relentless days of calculated abuse. A monumental painting depicting the charged atmosphere in the revolutionary tribunal during Marie Antoinette's desperate appeal to the mothers present regarding the incest accusation. Her figure is centrally positioned, clad in simple, dark mourning clothes, lending her the visual authority of a classical statue of purity or justice, while the faces of the jurors and the tricoteuses show conflicting expressions of shock, malice, and sudden, unwelcome empathy, highlighting the fragile boundary between political hatred and fundamental human connection. A dramatic low-angle depiction of the red-painted scaffold steps. Marie Antoinette, frail and exhausted after the long ordeal, stumbles upon the final steps, her movement clumsy due to her bound hands, accidentally stepping on the executioner's foot. The moment captures her whispering, "Pardon me, monsieur," her ultimate, reflexive act of royal etiquette and dignity, performed amidst the overwhelming horror,
rendered with the intense focus and emotional solemnity of a classical tragic hero facing the inevitable sublime fate. A deeply emotional, expressive depiction of Marie Antoinette during the 50th day of imprisonment, suffering from severe, untreated uterine hemorrhaging and anemia. Her body is physically failing, rendered pale and almost ethereal against the brutal stone of the Conciergerie.
This focus on internal physical collapse transforms her into a romanticized symbol of the afflicted monarchy, whose blood literally drains away, contrasting her vulnerable mortality with the cold, unfeeling machinery of the revolutionary state designed to prolong her suffering for political gain. An architectural drawing, imbued with dramatic light and shadow, contrasting the pristine, symmetrical plans of Dr. Guillotin's machine, promising enlightened, painless death, with the grim, shadowed reality of the actual device used on October 16th. The guillotine is depicted as a broken classical column, symbolizing the ruin of Enlightenment principles, showcasing the dull, heavy blade specifically, symbolizing the calculated betrayal of humanism demanded by the Revolutionary Tribunal for maximum theatrical effect and extended cruelty. A symbolic, allegorical scene illustrating the two Marie Antoinette. One, the malicious, fictionalized queen, attributed with the "let them eat cake" quote, represented as a grotesque caricature laughing in opulence. The other, the real, suffering woman, frail and dignified on the execution cart. The powerful romantic contrast highlights the propaganda machine's successful erasure of her humanity, transforming her tragic end into a necessary, almost beautiful political sacrifice, rendered in highly saturated colors to emphasize the emotional distortion of historical truth. A dramatic depiction of Marie Antoinette in the austere conciergerie cell, her spirit broken after 76 days of cruel surveillance and deliberate malnutrition. Two revolutionary guards stand menacingly in the oppressive shadows, their features coarse and triumphal, symbolizing the pervasive violation of privacy and dignity. The light filters weakly through a high grate, illuminating the rough, lice-infested straw mattress and the small, desperate calendar scratched into the damp, monumental stone wall, capturing the overwhelming despair of her final confinement. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, emphasizing the psychological siege and the monumental weight of despair in the manner of a dramatic historical fresco. The agonizing procession of the former Queen Marie Antoinette upon the filth-laden orger cart, traversing the cobbled Rue Saint-Honoré towards the Place de la Révolution, her frail wrists bound tightly behind her back, forcing a strained, unnatural posture of agonizing dignity. Triumphant revolutionary masses line the street, their faces contorted in a grotesque symphony of hatred, spitting insults and throwing refuse, while a tempestuous, bruised sky looms above, capturing the brutal spectacle of public martyrdom and the collapse of the Ancien Régime. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, highly detailed, expressive oil painting. The agonizing procession of the former Queen Marie Antoinette upon the filth-laden orger cart, traversing the cobbled Rue Saint-Honoré towards the Place de la Révolution, her frail wrists bound tightly behind her back, forcing a strained, unnatural posture of agonizing dignity. Triumphant revolutionary masses line the street, their faces contorted in a grotesque symphony of hatred, spitting insults and throwing refuse, while a tempestuous, bruised sky looms above, capturing the brutal spectacle of public martyrdom and the collapse of the Ancien Régime. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, highly detailed, expressive oil painting. An intensely emotional portrait capturing the morning of October Muisez, Mudbake 1790 revealing Marie Antoinette's hair, once legendary, now starkly and completely bleached white by basic 76 days of deprivation, chronic hemorrhage, and existential terror within the medieval confines of the Conciergerie. Her expression must convey profound, silent resignation, a classical mask of tragedy framed by the rough, newly shorn strands, illuminated by a stark, unforgiving prison light,
symbolizing the indelible mark of suffering inflicted by institutionalized cruelty. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, focusing on the terrible physical transformation wrought by calculated cruelty. Illustrate the horrific moment of the guillotining, the dull, heavy blade of the national razor impacting Marie Antoinette's neck not once, but struggling through the bone and sinew, necessitating a second, agonizing drop, witnessed by 50,000 screaming citizens hungry for spectacle. Focus on the sharp geometry of the blood-splattered scaffold platform, contrasting violently with the intense, chaotic emotional release of the revolutionary mob below, a scene of sublime terror and mechanical perfidy, betraying the guillotine's promise of humanity. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, extreme high contrast, dramatic chiaroscuro. The climactic courtroom scene during the 20-hour trial, focusing on Marie Antoinette's moment of defiant, heartbroken response to the monstrous, fabricated accusation of incest involving her young son, Louis Charles, a vile manipulation of justice. Her figure, though gaunt and weary from incarceration, must embody classical, maternal virtue, rising against the torrent of injustice, appealing directly to the tearful gallery of mothers present, shattering the revolutionary facade of legality. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, captured as a grand historical painting, emphasizing tragic heroism amidst judicial corruption. A solemn depiction of Marie Antoinette's final steps upon the monumental, blood-red scaffold platform, her stumbling ascent followed by the instantaneous, quiet utterance of "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," to the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, having accidentally trod upon his foot. This moment of ultimate, innate aristocratic grace confronting profane revolutionary hatred must be emphasized, with the guillotine looming as a monumental, fatal architecture against a tumultuous sky, highlighting the sublime contrast between personal dignity and systemic barbarity. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, deep color saturation, emphasizing dignity in death. A tragic diptych contrasting the opulent, gilded hall of mirrors at Versailles, teeming with life, silk, and courtly splendor, 1785, with the desolate, lime-strewn mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, Moedijk 1790 by, where Marie Antoinette's unceremoniously discarded body lies next to common criminals. A solemn depiction of Marie Antoinette's final steps upon the monumental, blood-red scaffold platform, her stumbling ascent followed by the instantaneous, quiet utterance of "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," to the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, having accidentally trod upon his foot. This moment of ultimate, innate aristocratic grace confronting profane revolutionary hatred must be emphasized, with the guillotine looming as a monumental, fatal architecture against a tumultuous sky, highlighting the sublime contrast between personal dignity and systemic barbarity. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, deep color saturation, emphasizing dignity in death. A tragic diptych contrasting the opulent, gilded hall of mirrors at Versailles, teeming with life, silk, and courtly splendor, 1785, with the desolate, lime-strewn mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, Moedijk 1790 by, where Marie Antoinette's unceremoniously discarded body lies next to common criminals.
This juxtaposition highlights the crushing finality and deliberate political annihilation of monarchy, demonstrating the vanity of earthly power and the swift, devastating reach of revolutionary vengeance, rendered with neoclassical precision but infused with romantic pathos. An allegorical rendering of the moment the executioner displays Marie Antoinette's severed head to the frenzied Parisian crowds, symbolically marking the true, terrifying inauguration of the Reign of Terror and the normalization of political murder as state policy. The guillotine acts as a bloody altar around which the furies of revolution dance, clad in tattered tricolors, signifying the triumph of institutionalized rage over enlightened reason and the tragic start of widespread civilian slaughter. Neoclassicism blended with Romanticism, dynamic, expressive, oil on canvas, highly symbolic. a precise yet emotionally raw scene capturing Jacques-Louis David sketching the passing figure of the former queen from a cafe window along the route, documenting her face of hollowed, resigned despair upon the municipal filth cart. The focus should be on the stark reality of her grossly shorn white hair and the tight, painful line of her mouth, a silent witness to monumental suffering captured in rigid neoclassical lines, yet infused with the romantic melancholy and profound psychological weight of the historical moment of public execution. Neoclassicism blended with romanticism. The chilling moment immediately following the imperfect first strike of the guillotine blade, where a brief, horrific consciousness lingers due to the intentionally dulled edge, emphasizing the agonizing violation of Dr. Guillotin's promise of painless death. Capture the scene with dramatic lightning striking the scaffold, isolating the mechanics of death and the profound, unspeakable terror of the victim enduring this mechanical cruelty, framed by the dark, swirling clouds of fate and the roaring violence of the bloodthirsty spectators. Neoclassicism blended with romanticism, emphasizing internal suffering. An intensely dramatic visualization of the courtroom turning point, Marie Antoinette, weakened by imprisonment but galvanizing her remaining strength, turns toward the public mother's gallery, issuing her tragic, universally human appeal against the fabricated charge of unnatural acts. The light should center on her dignified, suffering profile, contrasting sharply with the shadowed, calculating figures of prosecutor Fouquier Tinville and the Revolutionary Tribunal, symbolizing maternal virtue besieged by perfidious political slander. Neoclassicism blended with romanticism. Depict the final, devastating indignity. The executioner, Sanson, hoisting the severed head for the public view, only for the wet, white strands to slip from his bloody grasp, causing the trophy to sickeningly drop back into the basket amidst the roaring, victorious applause of the mob. Neoclassicism blended with romanticism.
The composition must highlight the grotesque nature of this accidental barbarity, emphasizing the complete erasure of royal dignity and humanity, set against the severe, ominous architecture of the scaffold platform as a temple of terror. Neoclassicism blended with romanticism. Create a highly detailed oil painting capturing Marie Antoinette in the dim, stone confines of the conciergerie, immediately after the night her hair turned fully white, symbolizing the acute suffering wrought by calculated deprivation and psychic torment. Emphasize the contrast between her fragile, once regal posture and the cold, unyielding brutality of the medieval cell, rendered in the dramatic chiaroscuro typical of neoclassicism blended with romanticism, illustrating the sublime tragedy of the fallen sovereign. A dramatic tableau in the style of historical romanticism, depicting the moment Marie Antoinette stands before the Revolutionary Tribunal, her dignity shattered but momentarily resurrected as she appeals to the mothers in the gallery, protesting the vile, fabricated accusation of incest against her son. The scene must capture the intense, raw emotion, the judicial abuse framed by the cold, precise architecture of the courtroom, a profound study in moral darkness versus enduring maternal defense, rendered with solemn academic technique. Visualize the ultimate public degradation, the former queen forced onto the common, fetid wooden cart, her hands bound tightly behind her back, traversing the cobbled streets of Paris. The composition must juxtapose the elegant, classical lines of the Parisian buildings, neoclassicism, against the visceral, agonizing reality of her humiliation, romanticism, highlighting the symbolic stench of the revolution overpowering the scent of monarchy, bathed in the sickly light of a fateful autumn morning. A haunting, highly symbolic depiction of the guillotine platform on the Place de la Révolution, focusing not on the death itself, but on the chilling moment the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, deliberately dulls the blade,
transforming the advertised instrument of humane justice into a tool of calculated, prolonged agony. The scene is stark and geometrically precise, neoclassicism, yet heavy with the dread and moral corruption of the pending slow murder, romanticism, using deep reds and stoic shadows to convey impending catastrophe. Capture the drawn-out, agonizing procession along the Rue Saint-Honoré, focusing on the sheer magnitude of the raging, hateful crowd hurling insults and refuse at the slow-moving cart. The viewpoint should emphasize the overwhelming force of revolutionary passion, cultisserie, crushing the isolated figure of the queen, who maintains a ghostly, classical composure, her face a mask of resigned tragedy against the chaotic backdrop of thousands of vengeful citizens, presented in a grand, sweeping, historical narrative style.
Illustrate the final, poignant act of unconscious etiquette. Marie Antoinette, stumbling on the scaffold steps and whispering, "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose," to the executioner. This neoclassical moment of perfect, inherent dignity contrasts sharply with the looming, barbaric machinery and the frenzied, bloodthirsty atmosphere of the square, creating a powerful romantic depiction of human grace surviving governmental cruelty in the face of inevitable mechanical death. A dual-image composition, blending the extravagant, sunlit Rococo halls of Versailles, brimming with silks and mirrors, with the dark, damp, lice-infested stone misery of the conciergerie cell. The dramatic juxtaposition must highlight the catastrophic fall from absolute splendor to absolute destitution, emphasizing the swift, cruel irony of fate and the shattering of the Bourbon ideal, rendered with meticulous attention to architectural detail and highly expressive emotional contrast. A close-up, highly atmospheric depiction of the small, almost invisible calendar scratched into the rough stone wall of the conciergerie cell by Marie Antoinette's fingernail. 76 marks counting down to doom. This intimate, agonizing detail provides a quiet, romantic counterpoint to the grand revolutionary narrative, symbolizing the desperate internal struggle for survival and sanity under continuous psychological surveillance, presented with the austere realism of a classical still-life object infused with profound suffering. An allegorical painting depicting the spirit of the blunt guillotine blade rising like a specter over Paris immediately after Marie Antoinette's death, symbolizing the true genesis of the Reign of Terror and the cyclical nature of political violence. The composition must be formally balanced yet terrifyingly expressive, hinting that the architect of her suffering, Robespierre, is now himself marked by the machine he sanctified, linking her tragic fate to the subsequent national bloodbath. Recreate the precise moment Jacques-Louis David sketched Marie Antoinette from his café window during the agonizing procession. The image should focus on the artist's detached, neoclassical precision, capturing the ghastly, resigned expression of the queen, her roughly shorn white hair prominent, contrasting the cold documentation of the revolution with the profound, suffering human subject being immortalized in her deepest shame. A study in observing historical trauma.
Detail the macabre climax, the executioner hoisting the severed head for the crowd, only for the wet, white hair to slip through his hands, causing the head to drop back into the basket with an audible, repulsive sound. The artistic focus must be on the raw, unscripted horror of this moment, contrasted against the overwhelming, jubilant chaos of the 50,000 onlookers, emphasizing the total destruction of the queen's symbolic body and the descent into barbaric spectacle, executed with dramatic, romantic flair. a metaphorical scene illustrating the fabrication of the "let them eat cake" myth. A classical statue representing truth or justice stands blindfolded, while revolutionary propagandists in the foreground meticulously write the false quote onto scrolls, symbolizing the systematic dismantling of her character post-mortem. The underlying reality of starvation and judicial murder is hidden by this eloquent yet toxic literary lie, capturing the tragic romantic theme of reputation destroyed by political necessity within a formally balanced setting. A detailed oil painting capturing Marie Antoinette's final hours in the grim conciergerie, rendered in the profound chiaroscuro typical of a neoclassicism blended with romanticism style, emphasizing the cruel psychological architecture of her small, lice-ridden cell and the spectral, shocking transformation of her once golden hair to absolute white. A monumental symbol of systematic revolutionary cruelty and profound human endurance against inevitable fate, the ultimate tragedy of aristocratic suffering. Illustrate the dramatic moment during the trial where Marie Antoinette, utilizing a gesture of immense neoclassic dignity, turns to the assembled mothers in the gallery, appealing to the universal bond of maternity against the monstrous fabricated charge of incest leveled by Fouquier-Tinville, rendered with the intense, emotive lighting of romanticism. The scene must capture the sudden, momentary wavering of the bloodthirsty crowd, highlighting the sublime power of truth breaking through calculated tyranny, a formal portrait of judicial perfidy. Create a dramatic historical tableau vivant, utilizing the rich, sorrowful palette of neoclassicism blended with romanticism, depicting Marie Antoinette's excruciatingly slow, hour-long journey upon the vile, dung-smelling open cart, contrasted sharply against the elegant, familiar facades of the Rue Saint-Honoré. Emphasize the binding of her hands in an unnatural, torturous pose, and the relentless, screaming cacophony of the 30,000 vengeful spectators, transforming her passage into a ritualized public crucifixion designed for maximum degradation.
An elegiac, muted sketch, reminiscent of David's observation, but infused with the intense emotional weight of romantic lament, showing the deposed queen upon the open cart, focusing primarily on her face, hollow, resigned, framed by the crudely shorn white hair, her mouth a thin, rigid line of final, stoic neoclassic resistance against the chaotic, overwhelming tide of revolutionary vengeance. The scene must capture the profound silence of her inner defeat amidst the external, public storm of hatred and humiliation. Depict the final, poignant moment of neoclassic etiquette where Marie Antoinette, stumbling weakly upon the steps of the towering, blood-red scaffold on the Place de la Révolution, accidentally treads upon the executioner Charles-Henri Sanson's foot and whispers, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it intentionally." A solitary instance of supreme, inherent virtue confronting the massive, grotesque apparatus of political murder. The romantic light should dramatically illuminate this final, impossible gesture of human civility against the backdrop of the screaming, chaotic multitude. A highly dramatic, allegorical painting revealing the hidden horror of the execution. The moment the deliberately dulled guillotine blade descends, not with clean speed, but with grinding resistance, symbolizing the total betrayal of the promised revolutionary humanity, forcing the viewer to confront the visceral, agonizing reality of the multiple strikes reported by witnesses. The composition must juxtapose the elegant, neoclassic design of the killing machine against the profound romantic suffering it inflicts, a mechanical tragedy of calculated cruelty.
Visualize the massive, brightly painted red platform of the guillotine, 20 feet high, dominating the Place de la Révolution, viewed from below, emphasizing its scale as an industrial altar of sacrifice. The composition must combine the formal severity of neoclassic architecture with the wild, frenzied energy of the 50,000 surrounding citizens, illuminated by a harsh, romantic light, focusing on the moment the executioner raises the queen's severed head, her white hair slipping through his gloves, a grotesque, horrifying trophy displayed to the roaring masses. An extremely solemn and somber neoclassic depiction of the unceremonious burial of the former queen's remains in the unmarked mass grave at Madeleine Cemetery, showing the stark indignity of her body being covered with quicklime alongside common criminals, focusing on the revolutionary intent to utterly annihilate her memory and physical trace. The scene should be quiet and desolate, a powerful romantic statement about the final, chilling efficacy of political revenge aimed at total historical erasure and monumental injustice. Create an artwork contrasting two classical bas-relief panels. The left panel depicts the neoclassic ideal of the guillotine as swift, enlightened justice promoted by Dr. Jacques Cagnier.
Guillotine. The right panel depicts the romantic reality, the terrifying, protracted execution using a blunt blade, highlighting the revolutionary government's cynical exploitation of the machine for theatrical torment and political revenge, revealing the stark, tragic chasm between revolutionary rhetoric and the agonizing fate of the victim. Focus on a close-up, dramatic study of Marie Antoinette's hands bound tightly behind her back with coarse hemp rope during the cart ride, rendering the rough texture of the rope cutting into her emaciated wrists with intense, realistic detail. This intimate, romantic focus on physical suffering must be framed by the formal, neoclassic backdrop of the Parisian streets, symbolizing the individual's profound, agonizing powerlessness against the overwhelming, calculated force of state-sponsored humiliation and terror. A haunting, subdued interior scene showing the precise neoclassic structure of Marie Antoinette's prison wall in the Conciergerie, focusing intensely on the small, almost invisible calendar she scratched into the stone with her fingernail, 76 precise markings, each representing a day until her execution. Infusing this architectural detail with the immense, crushing romantic weight of anticipatory suffering and the stoic, measured counting down to ultimate demise, a silent monument to endured agony. Illustrate the terrifying shift marked by Marie Antoinette's execution, portraying her death not as an end, but as the precise, horrific neoclassic prelude to the ensuing reign of terror, visually depicting the guillotine as a darkly romantic portal opening behind her, through which shadowy, mass processions of future victims, the 16,594 citizens, begin to emerge, establishing her fate as the grim, calculated precedent for industrialized political murder that engulfed the entire nation. A high-detail illustration capturing Marie Antoinette's agonizing final journey upon the soiled tumbrel manure cart through the venomous crowds of the Rue Saint-Honoré on October 16, 1793. Depict the scene with the strict, elevated composition of neoclassicism, emphasizing her binding, her hands tied brutally behind her back, causing excruciating, visible tension, and her stark, overnight white hair against the dramatic, revolutionary red flags and the hostile, grotesque faces of the Parisian multitude. The atmosphere must blend the dignity of a martyr facing inescapable fate with the overwhelming emotional intensity and terror of romanticism,
focusing on the ultimate human degradation preceding the guillotine's fall and highlighting the profound pathos of her monumental sacrifice. A profound, dark, academic painting rendered in the distinct style of neoclassicism blended with romanticism, capturing the precise, horrifying moment of Marie Antoinette's execution by the deliberately dulled blade of the guillotine at the Place de la Révolution.
The stark, architectural severity of the scaffold must contrast sharply with the raw, visceral trauma, implying the agony of the rumored second strike, hidden from the official narrative, but evident in the unnatural tension and copious blood splatter. Emphasize the monumental tragedy of the monarch's fall, juxtaposing the cold, ordered mechanics of revolutionary justice with the intense, savage brutality of political vengeance and the sublime, catastrophic annihilation of individual human dignity. Portray Marie Antoinette confined within the stark, cold geometry of the conciergerie cell, 76 days into her calculated torment. Depict the raw, dramatic contrast of her once golden hair, now rendered stark white against the gloomy, rigid stone, embodying the profound emotional agony and the physical decay wrought by state-sponsored starvation and perpetual, humiliating surveillance, casting a sublime shadow of inevitable tragedy upon the rigid structure of revolutionary justice. An oil painting capturing the climactic, horrifying moment of the sham revolutionary tribunal, where Marie Antoinette rises in dignified, neoclassical sorrow to confront the monstrous incest accusation. Illuminate the scene with dramatic, intense lighting, focusing on the anguished appeal in her expression, contrasted sharply with the cruel, rigid faces of the Jacobin judges, and the sudden, emotional silence of the previously bloodthirsty romantic crowd, highlighting the brutal corruption of revolutionary ideals. Generate a dramatic, high-contrast illustration of the Queen's final procession. Marie Antoinette, bound and exhausted, sitting rigidly upon the crude, foul-smelling orgia cart meant for common criminals, traversing the chaotic, densely packed Rue Saint-Honoré amidst the screaming, visceral fury of the romantic mob, contrasting her neoclassical poise with the base, visceral humiliation of the vehicle, emphasizing the calculated cruelty of this political spectacle designed for maximum degradation. Conceptual art piece depicting the ultimate betrayal of the Enlightenment promise embodied by the guillotine. Show the pristine, neoclassical machine stained by the tragic reality of failed strikes due to a deliberately blunted blade, with an overlay of Marie Antoinette's face in sublime, pre-mortem agony, emphasizing the mechanism as an engine of deliberate, excruciating torture rather than swift, humane justice, a dark, romantic satire of rational progress. A highly detailed, emotionally resonant scene depicting Marie Antoinette's final, micro-moment of classical composure on the scaffold steps, immediately after accidentally stepping on the executioner's foot. Capture the whispered, formalized apology, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," juxtaposed against the colossal, menacing structure of the guillotine and the frenzied, chaotic, romantic crowd below, highlighting the heartbreaking adherence to neoclassical etiquette amidst ultimate, terrifying destruction. Recreate the chilling moment captured by Jacques-Louis David from the café window. Marie Antoinette's profile in the cart rendered in stark, tragic realism, displaying profound exhaustion and inner resignation rather than open fear. Her roughly shorn white hair visible, while the background is a blur of furious, expressive, passionate, romantic street mobs and red revolutionary banners, a study in rigid despair versus chaotic rage. Illustrate the gruesome theatrical aftermath.
The executioner, a figure of rigid revolutionary duty, holding aloft the severed head by its stark white hair against the backdrop of the cheering, monstrously joyful romantic Parisian crowd. Depict the horrible moment when the wet hair slips through his blood-soaked gloves, causing the head to drop back into the basket, a sudden, visceral interruption of the intended neoclassical triumphal display, shocking in its raw brutality. A dark, claustrophobic interior painting of Marie Antoinette's cell, 11 by 9 feet, where neoclassical architecture meets Gothic despair. 2 imposing, rigid revolutionary guards are perpetually stationed, observing every agonizing detail, forcing the queen to use the latrine bucket while preserving a facade of aristocratic dignity, despite the absolute, demoralizing violation of her privacy over 76 days, bathed in a sickly, despairing light. Macro photograph showing the tiny, desperate scratch marks of a calendar etched by Marie Antoinette's fingernail into the rigid, ancient stone wall of the conciergerie, representing the 76 days counting down to her death. Use dramatic chiaroscuro lighting to emphasize the profound, lonely resignation of this neoclassical figure trapped within the indifferent structure of state power, a silent testament to endurance under extreme psychological duress. A stylized depiction of the systematic psychological warfare against the queen, illustrate her fragmented image reflected in shattered classical mirrors, surrounded by symbolic objects of her lost power, crowns, jewels, and the tools of her degradation, lice-infested straw, coarse uniform, embodying the romantic horror of having one's humanity systematically stripped away before the final neoclassical judgment of the state, focusing on fragmentation and mental anguish. A wide-angle view of the Place de la Révolution, bathed in the dramatic, blood-red light of a tumultuous sunset. The massive, architecturally precise guillotine stands as a rigid, neoclassical altar of death upon its high, scarlet platform, surrounded by a swirling, chaotic mass of 50,000 screaming citizens, emphasizing the overwhelming, sublime terror of the moment, marking Marie Antoinette's execution as the violent, dramatic inauguration of the Reign of Terror.
A dramatic close-up, historical painting showing the rough, brutal severing of Marie Antoinette's magnificent white hair by the executioner's coarse shears in the presence of jeering guards, emphasizing the raw, humiliating violence of this pre-execution rite. The queen maintains a frozen, neoclassical expression of passive endurance, while the romantic fury of the act destroys her last vestiges of physical vanity and royal identity, a prelude to the scaffold. A dramatic, neoclassical portrait capturing Marie Antoinette within the damp medieval confines of the conciergerie, her face illuminated by a single, mournful oil lamp, symbolizing the swift decay of majesty. Emphasize the shocking, premature pallor of her hair, which turns snow white during 76 days of psychological warfare and calculated deprivation, highlighting the romantic tragedy of a monarch consumed by the wrath of the revolutionary sublime. Render the ghastly procession of the condemned queen upon the open tumbrel, traditionally reserved for common thieves, juxtaposing her fading regal dignity with the stench and indignity of the makeshift dung cart. The composition must employ the dramatic sweep of romantic street scenes, yet retain the balanced, stark formality of neoclassical justice, where the masses become a turbulent, stone-faced jury against a monumental architectural backdrop. Illustrate the horrific climax on the Place de la Révolution, focusing not on the death itself, but on the profound betrayal of the Enlightenment ideal. The guillotine's mechanism, designed for humane speed, rendered torturous by the intentionally blunt, descending blade.
capture the terrifying, almost mythical scale of the crimson-painted scaffold while invoking the intense, emotional reaction of the shocked onlookers, merging stark realism with symbolic tragedy. A highly dramatic neoclassical court scene during the Revolutionary Tribunal, freezing the moment Marie Antoinette rises in righteous maternal agony to confront the monstrous accusation of incest leveled against her by her tormented son. The composition must focus on her dignified, albeit broken, silhouette, standing against the chaotic, bloodthirsty energy of the romantic revolutionary prosecutors, appealing to the universal justice of motherhood over political terror. Depict the agonizing slowness of the hour-long journey down the Rue Saint-Honoré, focusing on the Queen's face etched with exhaustion and resolute resignation, viewed through the cool, detached gaze of the witnessing neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David, sketching her doom from a window. Infuse the scene with the deep, melancholy pathos of romantic suffering, contrasting the cold documentation with the sublime despair of the subject. A highly dramatic neoclassical court scene during the Revolutionary Tribunal, freezing the moment Marie Antoinette rises in righteous maternal agony to confront the monstrous accusation of incest leveled against her by her tormented son. The composition must focus on her dignified, albeit broken, silhouette, standing against the chaotic, bloodthirsty energy of the romantic revolutionary prosecutors, appealing to the universal justice of motherhood over political terror. Depict the agonizing slowness of the hour-long journey down the Rue Saint-Honoré, focusing on the Queen's face etched with exhaustion and resolute resignation, viewed through the cool, detached gaze of the witnessing neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David, sketching her doom from a window. Infuse the scene with the deep, melancholy pathos of romantic suffering, contrasting the cold documentation with the sublime despair of the subject.
Conceptualize the guillotine not merely as a machine, but as a chilling, modern altar of sacrifice, ironically marketed as the fruit of enlightened science, yet actively employed as an instrument of prolonged, targeted cruelty against the former queen. The image should present the apparatus with neoclassical symmetry, but shrouded in the dark, fearful atmosphere of romantic political obsession, highlighting the ultimate collapse of reason into vengeful passion. Focus intently on the solitary moment upon the red-stained steps of the scaffold, capturing Marie Antoinette's final, involuntary act of impeccable court etiquette, the quiet apology, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose," after stumbling upon the executioner's foot. Frame this gesture with severe neoclassical clarity against the deafening, turbulent background of the romantic revolutionary mob, emphasizing the profound pathos of doomed refinement. A solitary, haunting close-up of the rough stone wall inside the conciergerie cell, where Marie Antoinette meticulously scratched 76 faint, despairing tally marks, her countdown to death, using only her fingernail. The image should evoke the stark, oppressive geometry of the prison, neoclassicism, combined with the overwhelming sense of individual, tragic isolation and morbid anticipation, romanticism. Create a moment of shocking, grotesque aftermath. The executioner, having failed to secure the severed head of the queen due to the blood and sweat coating her newly shorn white hair, watches in momentary horror as it slips and falls back into the awaiting basket. The scene must capture the immediate, visceral shock in neoclassical detail, amplified by the triumphant, savage clamor of the romanticized crowd. Illustrate the insidious triumph of revolutionary propaganda, contrasting the serene, dignified reality of the condemned queen, her actual final moments, with the malicious, fabricated image of the "let them eat cake" tyrant.
use strong neoclassical allegory to depict truth battling the winged specter of lies, overlaid with the dramatic, emotional shadows of popular resentment and historical revisionism in the Romantic style. A panoramic, highly detailed composition depicting the execution as the foundational ritual of the Reign of Terror, where the Queen's singular tragedy transforms into a blueprint for systematic, industrial political murder. The scene should blend the rigid, formal structure of the public square, neoclassicism, with the horrifying, overwhelming scale of the surrounding, blood-intoxicated crowd and the looming shadow of future mass executions, romantic dread.
Focus on the calculated, agonizing process of dehumanization inflicted during her imprisonment, stripping away every vestige of royal identity, clothes, privacy, hygiene, sanity before her public death. Render this psychological dismantling through a symbolic, layered image where the former queen's ethereal, neoclassical perfection is systematically eroded by the dark, chaotic forces of revolutionary vengeance, depicted with profound romantic sympathy for the violated soul. A high-contrast illustration in the style of David, capturing the former Queen Marie Antoinette confined within the stark, damp stone walls of the Conciergerie, her once golden hair now streaming stark white due to acute suffering and systemic neglect. Depict the two unblinking, crude revolutionary guards watching her every movement, emphasizing the profound psychological violation and the tragic collapse of royal splendor into abject misery. The scene must evoke the stoic tragedy of a classical heroine enduring barbaric fate. Visualize the climax of Marie Antoinette's sham trial, where the monstrous accusation of incest is leveled. Render the courtroom using dramatic chiaroscuro reminiscent of romantic tragedy, focusing on her moment of absolute, dignified maternal outrage as she appeals silently to the gallery of mothers, a lone figure of classical virtue defying the venomous, calculated malice of the Republic's revolutionary tribunal. Create a grand, mournful tableau vivant depicting the final, agonizing one-hour journey of Marie Antoinette upon the foul, open wooden cart through the frenzied, hateful streets of Paris. Emphasize the unnatural, painful binding of her hands behind her back, forcing her into a posture of profound vulnerability. The pale, white figure, a stark neoclassical monument of suffering, moving slowly through the chaotic, emotionally sublime fury of the revolutionary mob. A dramatic painting capturing the precise moment Marie Antoinette stumbles on the steps of the scaffold, her fragile, weakened body momentarily leaning into the startled executioner, prompting her final, whispered, utterly civilized apology. "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur." Illuminate this scene with severe, unforgiving neoclassical light, contrasting her profound inner grace against the towering, blood-red mechanism of mechanized industrial death looming darkly above her. Illustrate the terrifying reality of the dull guillotine blade descending, not cleanly, but with savage, repeated force, shattering the Enlightenment's promise of humane death. Capture the grotesque theatricality of the executioner adjusting the mechanism for the second agonizing blow, while the 50,000 citizens roar with a sublime, terrifying bloodlust, revealing the true face of rock as the antithesis of justice. Portray the morbid victory, the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, gripping the severed head of Marie Antoinette by its shockingly white, newly shorn locks, hoisting the tragic trophy high above the ecstatic revolutionary multitude. The rendering must use sharp, detailed realism, highlighting the stark contrast between the former queen's classical features and the visceral, bloody spectacle of politically motivated destruction. Conceptualize a detailed, somber image of the conciergerie cell interior, concentrating on the faint, desperate calendar Marie Antoinette scratched onto the rough stone wall, marking 76 days until her scheduled demise. The overall mood should be deeply romantic and melancholic, reflecting her relentless, observed agony and the systematic, calculated disintegration of her mental resolve by her relentless captors. Design a poignant sketch styled after a classical depiction of a martyr, showing the anemic, failing body of Marie Antoinette suffering from untreated internal hemorrhaging in her narrow cell, symbolizing the deliberate decision by the revolutionary tribunal to use illness and deprivation as precursors to the final act of juridical terror, dissolving her physical form before they claimed her life. Illustrate the malicious propagation of the fictional "let them eat cake" quote as a corrosive revolutionary pamphlet being distributed among the angry crowds, contrasting this grotesque caricature with a faint, idealized neoclassical silhouette of the true suffering queen, emphasizing how cynical propaganda successfully erased her humanity before her physical execution. Capture the jarring, humiliating transition, Marie Antoinette being forcefully stripped of her few remaining vestiges of dignity, moving from the medieval shadows of the conciergerie into the open, filth-ridden transport cart. Use powerful, dynamic composition to juxtapose the memory of her opulent Versailles life, a ghostly neoclassical background, against the harsh, revolutionary reality of her public shaming and descent into terror. Create a monumental, allegorical fresco depicting Marie Antoinette's guillotining not as an end, but as the bloody cornerstone for the ensuing reign of terror. Show the blade falling, triggering a chaotic explosion of figures representing the 16,594 subsequent victims, blending neoclassical severity in the central figure with the widespread, emotionally charged horror of the revolution's escalating mass murder. Render a haunting, deeply atmospheric portrait capturing the stoic, distant gaze of Marie Antoinette based on Jacques-Louis David's contemporary sketch taken during her ride of shame. The image should convey profound, internalized resignation and classical composure amidst the vulgar, screaming chaos, immortalizing the moment she transcended immediate fear through sheer tragic dignity.
Depict the tragic transformation of the queen within the stark neoclassical severity of the conciergerie's dungeon, emphasizing the romantic horror of her hair turning pure white from calculated privation, a sublime portrait of suffering aristocratic grace against the backdrop of revolutionary steel and unforgiving stone, documenting the 76 days of enforced public degradation before the final scaffold spectacle. Envision the courtroom drama as a tragic, romantic tableau, where the structured, cold calculation of revolutionary justice, neoclassicism, brutally collides with the overwhelming, maternal pathos of the queen, defending her dignity against the vile, manufactured charge of incest, capturing the moment of universal feminine outrage that momentarily silenced the bloodthirsty Parisian mob, highlighting the betrayal of enlightened legal principles. Illustrate the torturous, hour-long procession to the scaffold on the rough, debasing cart meant for common criminals, a romantic symphony of public humiliation and calculated cruelty, contrasting the queen's final, internalized neoclassical restraint and silent dignity with the chaotic, screaming frenzy of the 30,000 vengeful citizens who lined the Rue Saint-Honoré, consuming her suffering as a macabre feast. Create a dramatic image centered on the guillotine platform, where the supposed neoclassical efficiency and humane promise of the revolutionary machine is exposed as a romantic horror show, detailing the shocking, hidden truth of the deliberately blunted blade, requiring multiple agonizing impacts, transforming the symbol of Enlightenment reform into an engine of ritualized theatrical state sadism. Sculpt a profound, emotionally resonant moment where the queen, shackled and broken upon the scaffold steps, stumbles and offers a final whispered apology of impeccable royal etiquette. "Pardon me, sir." A powerful, tragic manifestation of neoclassical grace and training, confronting the brute, messy reality of her imminent romantic doom before the vast, cheering Republican audience. Detail the oppressive, claustrophobic reality of the Queen's 11 by 9 foot cell in the Conciergerie, emphasizing the relentless 24-hour male surveillance as a specific tool of psychological warfare designed to strip her of all private human dignity, painting a romantic portrait of aristocratic fragility besieged by the crude, vulgar force of revolutionary necessity, a violation of the sacred self. Render the ultimate romantic indignity, the disposal of the former queen's remains in an unmarked mass grave, heaped with quicklime alongside common criminals. A deliberate act of historical erasure contrasted sharply against the grand, formal architecture of the city, symbolizing the complete revolutionary rejection of established neoclassical order and traditional funeral rites.
Juxtapose the faded memory of the glittering Baroque and neoclassical splendor of Versailles with the grim, cold reality of the Conciergerie dungeon and the foul, manure-scented death cart, illustrating the swift, catastrophic downfall of the Ancien Regime embodied in the broken physical form of Marie Antoinette, a tragic, romantic reflection on the fleeting nature of earthly power. Explore the deep irony, a central theme of romantic tragedy, where the guillotine, marketed as the pinnacle of enlightened, neoclassical efficiency and humanism by Dr. Guillotin, becomes the very instrument of prolonged torture and industrial political murder, a spectacular betrayal of revolutionary ideals symbolized entirely by the brutal reality of the Queen's final moments. Generate a close-up depiction of the Queen's hands bound tightly behind her back with coarse hemp rope, illustrating the calculated sadism of the unnatural positioning designed to ensure physical torment and loss of balance during the journey, transforming this specific detail into a romantic symbol of absolute physical and psychological subjugation beneath the indifferent, cold gaze of the neoclassical state. Visualize the moment immediately following the final, successful blade drop, the executioner hoisting the severed head by its stark white hair, only for the wet, bloody trophy to slip through his gloved fingers and strike the basket bottom with a sickening sound, a grotesque, shocking, romantic detail that breaks the neoclassical formality of the state execution ritual and elicits a thunderous, savage ovation. Depict the unsettling scene from the perspective of Jacques-Louis David, the neoclassical painter and revolutionary, sketching the Queen's skeletal, resigned face in the death cart, capturing the tension between the artistic desire for clear, precise historical documentation and the underlying romantic tragedy of the human soul extinguished by political fanaticism and systematic psychological warfare. Envision the tragic procession of the deposed Queen Marie Antoinette upon the crudely appointed Mist Khan muck cart, traversing the hostile cobblestones of revolutionary Paris, her pale, neoclassical profile etched with stoic resignation against the tumultuous, hateful crowds lining the Rue Saint-Honoré, capturing the moment of utter public debasement where aristocratic grace meets the vulgarity of vengeful democracy, rendered in the dramatic chiaroscuro style reminiscent of David's observational sketches, emphasizing the sublime suffering and irreversible fate of monarchy.
depict the claustrophobic interior of Marie Antoinette's conciergerie cell, a cramped, damp vault beneath the weight of judicial tyranny, focusing specifically on the shocking transformation of her once golden hair, now rendered stark white by systematic deprivation, untreated anemia, and the constant psychological torment of the intrusive revolutionary guards, illustrating the neoclassical ideal of suffering distilled into pure, tragic form, bathed in a single, pale shaft of romantic light filtering from an unseen opening, marking the 76th day of her soul's ruin. Illustrate the chilling moment on the blood-red scaffold of the Place de la Révolution, where the supposed instrument of enlightened justice, the guillotine, fails its promise. Capture the anguished, sublime tension as the deliberately dulled blade descends not once, but potentially twice upon the Queen's neck, transforming the swift Republican execution into a protracted, horrific spectacle of calculated governmental cruelty, reflecting the romantic horror of man's invention turned monstrous engine of political terror against a figure of classical tragedy. Create a dramatic neoclassical tableau within the austere courtroom, capturing Marie Antoinette's moment of profound moral defense against the monstrous charge of incest leveled by Fouquier Tinville. Depict her rising, an image of tragic dignity, appealing not to the judges but to the mothers present, utilizing strong architectural lines and dramatic gesture to emphasize the moral crisis and the temporary silencing of the revolutionary mob by the sheer heartbreaking weight of her maternal protest, a pure embodiment of stoic virtue confronting vile slander. Generate a poignant, detailed image of a segment of the damp stone wall within Marie Antoinette's conciergerie prison, illuminated by a weak, melancholic light, showing the minuscule calendar meticulously scratched into the rock by her fingernail, 76 desperate tally marks counting down to the final judgment. A powerful romantic symbol of human fragility and the inexorable march of fate against the backdrop of cold, unyielding neoclassical architecture, representing the solitary soul confronting the abyss of preordained doom. Depict the stark, humiliating scene in the conciergerie cell where the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, roughly seizes the former queen's newly white hair, preparing to sever it with crude scissors before the leering guards. An initial brutal act of de-queening and dehumanization, emphasizing the severe contrast between her inherent noble posture and the forced degradation, rendered with the solemn, dark tones of a Baroque tragedy, framing this as the moment the ritualized rachet, vengeance, formally begins, stripping away the last vestiges of Versailles' grace and decorum. Depict the stark, humiliating scene in the conciergerie cell where the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, roughly seizes the former queen's newly white hair, preparing to sever it with crude scissors before the leering guards. An initial brutal act of de-queening and dehumanization, emphasizing the severe contrast between her inherent noble posture and the forced degradation, rendered with the solemn, dark tones of a Baroque tragedy, framing this as the moment the ritualized rachet, vengeance, formally begins, stripping away the last vestiges of Versailles' grace and decorum.
Visualize the harrowing climax on the scaffold, the moment Charles-Henri Sanson attempts to display the severed head of the Queen to the ferocious, ecstatic crowds, capturing the shocking detail of the head momentarily slipping from his grasp due to the slickness of the white hair and blood, emphasized by the colossal, roaring presence of the 50,000 vengeful citizens encircling the Place de la Révolution, contrasting the visceral romantic horror of the physical act with the detached theatrical staging required by the new political order, a sublime depiction of collective bloodlust. Capture the agonizing, extended journey of the condemned sovereign aboard the open cart, forced to traverse the longest, most deliberately chosen route through Paris for 1 hour and 12 minutes, enduring a relentless, deafening storm of insults, spittle, and refuse hurled by the populace, detailing the excruciating bodily strain caused by her tightly bound wrists and the cart's jolting motion, reflecting the calculated, inhumane design of the revolutionary spectacle, treating the physical route as a ceremonial pathway to ruin, rendered with high emotional intensity and focus on the architecture of Parisian suffering. Recreate the scene observed by revolutionary artist Jacques-Louis David, who sketches the passing queen from a cafe window. Marie Antoinette sits rigidly on the exposed cart, her face a mask of profound, hollow resignation, neither fear nor defiance. Her thin lips pressed into a definitive, final line, emphasizing the stark, unsettling geometry of the common wooden cart, juxtaposed with the remnants of royal bearing, employing the severe, controlled lines of neoclassicism to portray the final, exhausted surrender of human dignity to inescapable historical necessity. Illustrate the intensely dramatic final sequence upon the high scaffold. Marie Antoinette, weakened and disoriented, accidentally steps upon the executioner's foot, uttering her last, almost unbelievable apology, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," a fleeting resurgence of innate royal etiquette and humanity amidst the absolute nadir of public disgrace and terror. Contrasting the delicacy of the whispered phrase with the towering, brutally efficient structure of the guillotine, symbolizing the eternal struggle between ingrained grace and barbaric political machinery. Depict the desolate, unceremonious burial of the former queen in the Madeleine Cemetery mass grave, where her body, alongside 8 common executed criminals, is hastily covered with quicklime to hasten decomposition and erase all trace of noble remains. An ultimate act of revolutionary annihilation designed to utterly extinguish her memory and physical presence from history. Presented as a somber, romantic landscape dominated by dark earth and the sublime, overwhelming silence following the immense public spectacle, a final, cruel negation of her existence.
Visualize the Place de la Révolution moments after the execution, the red-stained planks of the scaffold dominating the foreground, not merely as the site of one death, but as the grim altar initiating the reign of terror, a cascade of future political murders stemming from this initial precedent of staged cruelty. Using neoclassical symmetry to frame the machine of death and the departing crowds as participants in a dark, irreversible historical shift, transforming alleged justice into industrialized, propagandistic slaughter, echoing the fatalism of ancient Greek tragedy. Detail the claustrophobic cell where the queen, stripped of all regal artifice, finds her once golden locks turned spectral white by the 76 days of calculated degradation. Depict this moment in a stark, chiaroscuro lighting, emphasizing the neoclassical structure of the prison contrasted with the raw, overwhelming romantic despair etched upon her face. A tragic heroine awaiting the final, brutal act of the revolutionary tribunal and the predetermined verdict. Illustrate the rigid, cold, neoclassical courtroom scene where the queen, enduring hours of relentless judicial theater and false witness, finally breaks in an agonizing, deeply romantic appeal to universal motherhood against the monstrous, fabricated charge of incest. capturing the brief, sublime moment of collective societal shock before the tyranny resumed its calculated, deadly course toward the scaffold. Create a highly dramatic panoramic view of the agonizing procession on the open, filth-ridden tumbrel, contrasting the former majesty of the queen bound cruelly behind her back, with the savage revolutionary mob lining the Rue Saint-Honoré, rendering the scene in the intense, emotional brushwork of Romanticism against the stoic, grand architectural backdrop of Paris's enduring, indifferent stone facades. Depict the terrifying climax at the blood-red scaffold on the Place de la Révolution, focusing on the mechanical precision of the guillotine, a symbol of neoclassical science, juxtaposed with the brutal reality of the dull blade's failing descent, emphasizing the sheer horror and painful humiliation intended by the calculated, non-humane execution, a horrifying perversion of Enlightenment ideals. Render a symbolic image of the 76 days of psychological torture, showing the stoic queen etching calendar marks into the damp, cold prison wall with a fingernail, while two impassive, classically posed guards observe her private suffering, symbolizing the calculated annihilation of human dignity by the state, where every moment served as a refined instrument of agonizing breakdown.
Focus intensely on the Queen's final verbal defense, her desperate appeal to the conscience of the mothers in the crowd, a moment of sublime, tragic rhetoric rendered in the style of a grand historical painting, where classical composure momentarily cracks to reveal the raw, powerful emotion of a woman unjustly condemned, briefly shaking the very foundation of revolutionary fervor. A somber, deeply saturated portrait of the Queen immediately after her prematurely white hair is crudely shorn by the executioner's rough blade before the final ascent to the platform. Her remaining dignity is captured in the neoclassical restraint of her posture, battling the palpable, overwhelming atmosphere of romantic despair and imminent, overwhelming public disgrace. Based on the surviving sketches of David, create a detailed, highly emotive depiction of the Queen upon the slow-moving tumbrel, her features gaunt and resigned, a study in profound human suffering, where the idealized sovereign form has dissolved into the harsh, undeniable reality of a mortal woman facing her unjust, predetermined fate, emphasizing the cruel historical irony. Compose a powerful diptych illustrating the profound historical tragedy. On one side, Marie Antoinette in the height of her opulent glory at Versailles, framed by neoclassical grandeur. On the other, her pitiful, bound form swaying precariously on the rough executioner cart, passing the very palace walls, emphasizing the catastrophic fall from sublime height to abject public shame. Focus dramatically on the final, agonizing moment upon the massive scaffold steps, where weakness and pain cause the Queen to stumble, prompting her final, quiet apology to the executioner. Capture this ultimate, almost absurd act of royal decorum and etiquette amidst the surrounding chaotic romantic violence and the deafening, bloodthirsty noise of the revolutionary mob. Illustrate the horrifying conclusion where the executioner hoists the severed head by its now blood-soaked white hair, a gruesome trophy displayed to the roaring, frenzied crowd, emphasizing the shocking contrast between the classical ideal of a martyred queen and the brutal, visceral reality of industrial political murder, a terrifying scene of terrible, sublime violence and vengeance. A melancholic, atmospheric, romantic landscape depicting the hastily dug, anonymous mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, symbolizing the ultimate historical erasure and systematic denial of human dignity. The neoclassical principles of monumental remembrance are brutally negated by the scattering of quicklime and the profound anonymity of the final resting place. Capture the agonizing Béchau 76 days within the cold stone confines of the Conciergerie,
depicting the queen's profound loss of self as dignity was systematically stripped away by the relentless gaze of her male guards, culminating in her premature, spectral white hair, a monument to calculated despair and medical negligence, rendered in the high-contrast chiaroscuro favored by romantic tragedy. Envision the climax of the judicial farce within the revolutionary tribunal, where the queen, weakened by systematic psychological warfare, confronts the monstrous accusation of incest leveled using her terrified child, rendering the scene as a dramatic tableau of maternal despair, shattering neoclassical restraint, against the morally bankrupt backdrop of a predefined, vengeful verdict, signifying the ultimate collapse of law into ritualized political malice. Illustrate the agonizing, hour-long procession of the former sovereign upon the vile, mist-scented municipal dung cart, a deliberate substitution for the closed carriage of aristocratic dignity, her figure rigidly bound and swaying precariously against the brutal cobblestones, transforming the journey into a spectacle of maximum public shame along the Rue Saint-Honoré, a romantic rendering of final, undeserved humiliation under the merciless gaze of the enraged Parisian masses. Detail the final, tragic ascent to the blood-red scaffold at the Place de la Révolution, capturing the queen's instinctive, final utterance of courtly apology upon stumbling, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," to the executioner whose foot she trod upon, highlighting this poignant, almost absurd act of neoclassical etiquette amidst overwhelming romantic horror and public frenzy, minutes before the calculated brutality of the dull blade. Portray the shocking, brutal culmination of the revolutionary spectacle, focusing on the revelation that the guillotine's blade was deliberately dulled, a conscious rejection of its promised Enlightenment-era humanism, requiring agonizing multiple strikes to sever the head, transforming the swift death into a torturous, drawn-out climax of state-sanctioned revenge, a grotesque and sublime violation of dignity observed by 50,000 baying citizens, demanding blood and agonizing suffering. Design a prompt emphasizing the shift from justice to codified terror, visualizing Marie Antoinette's plight as the terrifying prototype for the reign of terror, where political revenge systematically dismantled human dignity, establishing the precedent that all perceived enemies deserved complete societal erasure, turning the execution into a ritualized public theater aimed at profound psychological terror across the European monarchies, framed by the grim objectivity of historical judgment.
Recreate the haunting scene captured by Jacques-Louis David from his cafe window, the spectral portrait of the exhausted queen passing by, her prematurely whitened hair roughly shorn, her mouth pressed into a thin line of profound, dignified resignation against the revolutionary fervor. Visualizing her weary, stoic figure as the ultimate tragic subject, an emblem of fallen majesty overwhelmed by the uncontrollable, chaotic forces of romantic revolution. Explore the tactile and olfactory assault during the execution procession, the rough, tight hemp ropes biting into the queen's emaciated wrists, the unavoidable stench of animal refuse clinging to the cart, the cold mud and rotten vegetables hurled by the crowd, juxtaposing this vulgar sensory reality against the memory of Versailles' luxurious excess, a dramatic neoclassical contrast underscoring her catastrophic fall from sublime power to abject, observed misery. Focus intimately on the horrific aftermath, depicting the moment the executioner, gripping the shorn white locks, presents the severed head as a trophy, only for the wet hair to slip from his bloody grasp, causing the head to fall back into the collection basket with an audible, sickening thud. A macabre interruption of the ritualized spectacle that momentarily silenced the triumphant, bloodthirsty roar of the gathered revolutionary masses, emphasizing the raw, visceral horror.
Juxtapose the fabricated, callous myth of the queen advising the starving populace to eat cake, a brilliant piece of revolutionary propaganda intended to justify utter brutality, with the agonizing reality of her systemic starvation, psychological torture, and final, excruciating execution, highlighting the enduring power of cynical political fiction to obliterate human truth and render a complex figure into a necessary, simple villain worthy of absolute destruction. Visualize the final indignity, the disposal of the former queen's remains in the unmarked, common grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, her body tossed alongside common criminals, hastily covered with quicklime to erase her existence entirely, emphasizing the revolutionary government's successful intent to deny her historical presence and dignity, achieving not just death, but complete, systematic historical obliteration, a grim, neoclassical accounting of fate. Depict Marie Antoinette's execution not as an ending, but as the precise, terrifying prelude to the industrial-scale political murder of the Reign of Terror, illustrating how her meticulously planned public torture served as the blueprint for systematically erasing the humanity of 16,594 subsequent victims, transforming the guillotine from an emblem of Enlightenment progress into the efficient, chilling instrument of calculated populist paranoia and unending, dramatic societal breakdown.
Envision the Queen, Marie Antoinette, confined within the stark 11 by 9-foot dungeon of the Conciergerie, her once golden tresses now tragically bleached white by fever, anemia, and systematic deprivation. Capture the crushing weight of two omnipresent revolutionary guards observing her every movement. A neoclassicism blended with romanticism study emphasizing the solemnity of psychological warfare against the backdrop of crumbling aristocratic grandeur, rendered in deep chiaroscuro to highlight the profound, agonizing solitude of the deposed monarch during her 76 days of calculated torment. A dramatic, classically composed tableau portraying the moment Marie Antoinette, pale and dignified amidst the revolutionary tribunal, confronts the monstrous accusation leveled against her using her own 8-year-old son. Depict this scene in a neoclassicism blended with romanticism style, using severe architectural lines of the courtroom contrasting sharply with the raw, heart-rending emotional appeal to the mothers in the gallery, emphasizing the sublime horror of judicial perfidy and the collapse of human decency under the terror's calculated malice. Illustrate the torturous, hour-long procession of the condemned queen atop the foul, open tumbrel cart meant for common criminals. Traversing the Rue Saint-Honoré, surrounded by 30,000 shrieking, vengeful citizens. Render this in a neoclassicism blended with romanticism style, contrasting her rigid, broken posture and newly shorn white hair with the chaotic, grotesque energy of the mob. Employing the muted palette of late autumn and focusing on the crushing weight of public shame as an intentional act of state brutality, forcing the audience to bear witness to the collapse of dignity. Recreate the atmosphere captured in Jacques-Louis David's somber sketch, Marie Antoinette moments before the scaffold, her face a mask of profound, internalized tragedy. The neoclassicism blended with romanticism style, emphasizing the stoic acceptance of her fate while retaining the intense emotional residue of her suffering. Focus on the stark geometry of the blood-red scaffold, contrasting with the delicate yet ruined structure of her facial features. A final testament to human resilience facing total, merciless annihilation. Capture the horrific, suppressed truth of the guillotine on the Place de la Révolution. The Queen's final seconds rendered not in quick mercy, but in agonizing prolongation due to the committee-ordered dulling of the execution blade.
a neoclassicism blended with romanticism interpretation, focusing on the red-painted platform structure, neoclassical clarity, juxtaposed with the violent, chaotic struggle against mechanical failure, romantic horror, hinting at the unspeakable nature of state-sponsored, ritualized murder requiring multiple, agonizing strikes. A powerful neoclassicism blended with romanticism depiction for Marie Antoinette stumbling onto the execution platform, her hands bound cruelly behind her, accidentally stepping on the executioner's foot, and whispering her final, poignant apology. Emphasize the almost absurd resilience of royal etiquette surviving the ultimate degradation, set against the towering, blood-red menace of the guillotine and the stormy, dramatic sky of impending doom, highlighting this last, quiet moment of profound, unnecessary grace. A symbolic neoclassicism blended with romanticism visualization of the 76 days of psychological warfare, depicting the queen carving her calendar tally marks into the stone wall of the conciergerie cell using her fingernail. The composition should evoke classical tragedy, showing the slow erosion of her identity, where her former opulent image subtly fades into the ghostly reality of the fetid, lice-ridden straw mattress and the unblinking eyes of her perpetual jailers, measuring her march toward the inescapable terminus. Illustrate the violent, calculated moment Charles Henry Sanson roughly shears the Queen's stark white hair in her cell, the first public act of physical desecration before the death procession. Apply a stark neoclassicism blended with romanticism aesthetic, focusing on the harsh, unflattering light revealing the brutality of the act, symbolizing the revolutionary dismantling of monarchical iconography and the agonizing commencement of her terminal humiliation, watched by sneering guards who relish her visible distress. Depict the contrast as the slow-moving open cart passes the grand facade of the Tuileries Palace, where Marie Antoinette once reigned, now shadowed by the approaching guillotine. Use the neoclassicism blended with romanticism style to emphasize the monumental indifference of the classical architecture against the intensely personal, heartbreaking shame of the solitary figure, illustrating the abrupt and tragic transition from absolute splendor to absolute desolation, marked by the pervasive smell of manure and the relentless roar of the vengeful Parisian crowd. A chilling, somber neoclassicism blended with romanticism scene depicting the unceremonious burial of the Queen's body in the unmarked mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, covered hastily with quicklime to accelerate decay. The composition must emphasize the tragic finality and the revolutionary intent of total erasure, showing the absence of dignity or ceremony and the brutal efficiency of her annihilation, transforming a queen into an unidentifiable historical ghost against the cold, dark Parisian earth. Render the revolutionary tribunal scene in a dark, imposing neoclassicism blended with romanticism manner, highlighting the prosecutor Antoine Fouquier-Tinville's calculated cruelty and the predetermined verdict, contrasting the cold, unyielding legal formality with the profound moral corruption underlying the public spectacle. Let the only light source dramatically illuminate the Queen's face, revealing her silent, dignified horror at the utter collapse of justice and the mockery of legal due process. An epic, wide-angle neoclassicism blended with romanticism view of the Place de la Révolution, where the red guillotine stands as a brutal, geometric monument amidst the 50,000 cheering citizens. This final scene must capture the overwhelming, terrifying energy of the triumphant mob consuming the tragic sacrifice, symbolizing the moment Marie Antoinette's death inaugurated the true, industrial scale of the Reign of Terror, a victory of political vengeance over any semblance of human empathy. a solemn, high-contrast chiaroscuro rendering in the style of David, depicting Marie Antoinette, 37, within the stark 11 by 9-foot stone vault of the Conciergerie. Her gaze is fixed and distant, radiating sublime suffering after 76 days of public humiliation. Her once golden hair now a cascade of stark, prematurely whitened strands, illuminated only by a single, mournful oil lamp, symbolizing the calculated erosion of her regal spirit before the final act of revolutionary theater. Illustrate the horrific nadir of the revolutionary tribunal, Marie Antoinette rising amidst the neoclassical severity of the courtroom, her posture a final, defiant monument of maternal dignity, facing the stunned, bloodthirsty gallery as she rejects the monstrous charge of incest leveled by the manipulation of her own son. Capture the pivotal, silent pause of terror and moral shock that briefly quelled the revolutionary fervor, rendered with the dramatic lighting and heightened emotionality characteristic of Romantic history painting. A vast panoramic scene of the Rue Saint-Honoré, where the doomed queen is transported on a vile, open wooden cart, a symbol of ultimate, calculated degradation. Her hands agonizingly bound behind her back, forcing a painful, precarious balance, while 30,000 citizens line the neoclassical facades, screaming a chaotic chorus of hatred. The composition must emphasize the tragic isolation of the royal figure against the overwhelming, turbulent energy of the vengeful populace, executed with rich, somber, romantic colors.
Depict the moment immediately saw after the first failed descent of the guillotine blade, a symbol of supposed Enlightenment progress, revealing the agonizing truth of Charles-Henri Sanson's blunt executioner's instrument, designed for prolonged political torture rather than humane death. Render the bright, blood-red platform contrasting sharply with the pallor of the victim, capturing the sublime horror of the realization that the revolutionary promise was a brutal, calculated lie, utilizing the crisp lines of neoclassicism to frame the violent, romantic climax. A close-up, highly detailed sketch reminiscent of David's rapid observational style, capturing the queen's final, exhausted stumble upon the blood-slicked steps of the scaffold, her eyes momentarily meeting the executioner's foot upon which she treads. The expression should convey the profound pathos and tragic irony of her final, quiet apology. "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur." A fleeting, anachronistic gesture of royal etiquette against the backdrop of revolutionary chaos and imminent death. A highly structured neoclassical composition showing Jacques-Louis David seated calmly at a Parisian café window, sketching the emaciated, resigned profile of Marie Antoinette as the open, reeking dung cart passes by. The scene must starkly juxtapose the cold, clinical process of artistic and political documentation with the raw, intense suffering of the subject, conveying the detached cruelty inherent in transforming human agony into historical record, rendered in dramatic sepia tones. A dramatically lit, romantic illustration capturing the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, hoisting the newly severed head of Marie Antoinette by her wet, startlingly white hair, displaying the gruesome trophy to the frenzied, cheering populace gathered on the Place de la Révolution. The composition must focus on the unsettling contrast between the classical dignity of the surrounding architecture and the shocking, immediate barbarity of the act, emphasizing the revolutionary triumph achieved through theatrical violence. A somber, detailed rendering of a rough, cold stone wall within the damp confines of the Conciergerie cell, showing Marie Antoinette's fingernail-scratched calendar, 76 agonizing marks leading towards the predetermined date of execution.
The image should evoke the relentless passage of time and the silent, classical endurance of the queen against calculated psychological warfare, utilizing deep shadows and textural emphasis to capture the claustrophobic dread of the medieval dungeon structure.
Illustrate a dark, intimate scene inside the conciergerie cell where Marie Antoinette is forced to attend to her needs while high-porsche, uniformed revolutionary guards observe her 24 hours a day. The composition must convey the total annihilation of privacy and personal dignity through the stark, unforgiving light typical of neoclassicism, injecting the raw, powerful shame and despair of romanticism into the subject matter, emphasizing the cruelty of systematic degradation. A mournful, wide-angle depiction of the unhallowed mass grave at Madeleine Cemetery, where Marie Antoinette's body is unceremoniously dumped with 8 other condemned souls, covered hastily with quicklime to erase all trace of her regal existence. The scene should be rendered with a neoclassical sense of desolate landscape and monumental loss, infused with the romantic sadness of a forgotten, erased martyrdom, emphasizing the revolutionary goal of total obliteration. A satirical yet somber allegorical painting depicting the revolutionary propagandists crafting the "let them eat cake" lie. A shadowy figure writing the malicious fabrication, contrasting it with a ghostly, dignified silhouette of the actual queen enduring torture. The style must employ the structured allegory of neoclassicism to expose the emotional manipulation and profound injustice, highlighting the power of manufactured myth over tragic truth in a romantic atmosphere of deceit. Envision an epic, turbulent canvas showing the moment Marie Antoinette's execution catalyzes the true beginning of the Reign of Terror. The guillotine stands as a central, terrifying neoclassical monument of industrial murder, surrounded by churning clouds of revolutionary rage, symbolizing the descent into widespread, systemic violence, where political revenge replaces justice, merging the grandeur of historical spectacle with the terrifying chaos of burgeoning societal collapse. Generate an allegorical painting in the style of neoclassicism blended with romanticism, capturing the tragic figure of Marie Antoinette in the dim, oppressive cell of the conciergerie, where the unforgiving stone architecture speaks of absolute judicial finality. Show the dramatic contrast between her former royal grace and the stark reality of her confinement, emphasizing the sublime horror of her snow-white hair, an overt manifestation of 76 days of calculated, agonizing deprivation and ceaseless surveillance by the cynical architects of despair. Create a dramatic neoclassicism blended with romanticism depiction of the Queen's final procession, seated upon the foul, open wooden charrette, the mistkarren, meant for common criminals, a calculated affront to royal prerogative. Illuminate the stark, unflinching agony in her expression as the slow, agonizing journey traverses the unforgiving cobblestones, her hands cruelly bound behind her back, forcing an impossible posture, while the surrounding mob embodies the terrifying force of democratic fury consuming the last vestiges of monarchical dignity. Illustrate the chilling, geometric precision of the guillotine structure, rendered in severe neoclassical lines, juxtaposed with the romantic horror of the event it facilitates. The focus is on the moment following the first fall of the intentionally dulled blade, a terrifying betrayal of the promised swift demise, emphasizing the violation of enlightened principles as the revolutionary tribunal weaponized prolonged suffering, transforming swift death into theatrical torture for the cheering, expectant populace.
an oil painting capturing the zenith of judicial theater in the Tribunal Révolutionnaire, employing the balanced composition of neoclassicism to frame the ultimate moment of romantic pathos. Marie Antoinette, a figure of tragic, skeletal grace, rises against the monstrous, fabricated charge of incest. Her appeal to the mother's present must radiate moral clarity and suffering, illuminating the stark conflict between profound maternal dignity and the surrounding assembly of jurors and prosecutors, whose dark countenance embodies the triumph of political terror. Create a highly detailed interior scene adhering to the stark clarity of neoclassicism, depicting the confines of Marie Antoinette's 11 by 9 foot cell in the Conciergerie. The viewer's attention is drawn to the rough-hewn stone wall where she meticulously scratched 76 silent marks, a tragic, ephemeral calendar counting down to the 16th of October. This composition should convey the oppressive weight of time and the profound psychological fortitude required for such an act of final reckoning. A subtle yet intense romantic contemplation on human endurance against an immutable, predetermined fate. A solemn, historical sketch rendered with the sharp, defining lines of neoclassicism, focusing on the captive queen as she passes the café where Jacques-Louis David immortalized her image, capturing the historical weight of her fall. The composition must highlight the profound psychological resignation etched onto her gaunt, exposed face, a study in silent suffering and absolute surrender to destiny, while emphasizing the intense, unflinching gaze of the artist and the victim, freezing this moment of public ignominy and sublime, tragic historical finality. Design a deeply allegorical diptych combining the airy grandeur of neoclassical architecture with the despairing mood of romanticism. One side depicts the Trianon, replete with marble and gilding, symbolizing lost sovereignty.
The other shows the squalid conciergerie cell, a monument to abject misery and intentional degradation, illustrating how the calculated revolution replaced divine right with systematized, unforgiving cruelty, stripping away every token of identity until only raw, defenseless humanity remained. Envision the climactic scene on the Place de la Révolution, employing dramatic, romantic lighting, perhaps a somber, overcast sky, to emphasize the monumental scale of the guillotine scaffold, the altar of revolutionary sacrifice. Marie Antoinette, weak and unsteady, stumbles upon the steps, accidentally treading upon the executioner's foot. Capture the sublime, poignant contrast in that final, involuntary whisper, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," a definitive neoclassical gesture of courtly grace offered amidst the apex of vulgar, revolutionary violence and total personal annihilation. A propaganda poster mock-up executed in a severe, didactic neoclassical style, designed to expose the cynical, calculated nature of the revolution's psychological warfare. The central image is a distorted caricature of Marie Antoinette, mouth agape, with the invented "let them eat cake" quote, contrasting sharply with the textual description of the real, systematic malnutrition and psychological torture she endured. The prompt demands an exploration of how fabricated morality was used to justify the profound, romantic inhumanity of her targeted degradation. Create an intensely dramatic late Romantic portrait of Charles-Henri Sanson, the royal executioner, years after the Reign of Terror, reflecting upon his forced complicity in Marie Antoinette's non-humane demise. The prompt requires a stark chiaroscuro effect, highlighting the moral weight of his secret knowledge regarding the intentionally dulled blade, a revelation that exposed the calculated barbarity lurking beneath the mask of enlightened execution and conveyed the tragedy of a man compelled by a vengeful state to violate humanitarian principles.
A desolate landscape painting, heavy with the pathos and gloom characteristic of late Romanticism, depicting the unhallowed grounds of the Madeleine Cemetery. Focus on the raw earth covering the mass grave where Marie Antoinette's body, stripped of all royal and human dignity, was cast and covered with caustic quicklime. The composition should use subdued, cold colors to represent the complete erasure of identity and the revolution's final, unforgiving act of absolute destruction, symbolizing the systematic dismantling of a monarch's historical presence by brutal, pragmatic decree and popular vengeance. Render the immediate aftermath of the execution on the blood-soaked scaffold using the elevated drama of neoclassicism blended with the visceral horror of Romanticism.
Focus intensely on the chilling sight of Marie Antoinette's severed head, initially raised as a trophy to the screaming populace, only to slip from the executioner's grasp and fall back into the receiving basket with a sickening sound. This single, final indignity must powerfully convey the ultimate triumph of chaos and abjection over all pretense of controlled, dignified order, marking the horrific climax of her public torture. Visualize the queen in the conciergerie, her regal essence eroded by calculated deprivation, her once golden hair transformed to a stark, premature white, reflecting the horror of 76 days of continuous psychological surveillance and physical agony, rendered in stark chiaroscuro reminiscent of neoclassical historical painting, capturing the moment of her total abandonment to fate, a subject of revolutionary barbarity disguised as justice. Compose a dramatic illustration of the 16-hour trial, wherein the former sovereign stands accused before a tribunal whose judgment was foretold 2 days prior, focusing specifically on the grotesque, false accusation of incest. Capture the momentary silence of the stunned, bloodthirsty Parisian crowd, broken only by the Queen's dignified, despairing appeal to all mothers present, emphasizing the tragic collision of judicial form and inherent moral revulsion, a sublime depiction of truth betrayed by tyrannical calculation. Detail the agonizing 1-hour, 12-minute procession of the condemned queen, chained and forced upon the fetid, common dung cart through the merciless, jeering throngs lining the Rue Saint-Honoré, emphasizing the calculated governmental attempt to extinguish every vestige of royal dignity by choosing the slowest, most humiliating route past her former palaces, transforming her final journey into a protracted, public ritual of abject and utter degradation, a true romantic study in public suffering. Capture the precise, poignant moment Marie Antoinette ascends the scaffold steps, her hands cruelly bound behind her back in an unnatural posture, causing her inevitable stumble, leading to her final, immortal utterance of quiet etiquette. "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Juxtapose this profound, inherent dignity against the stark, towering edifice of the gleaming red guillotine, symbolizing the final, unbearable rupture between the elegance of the Ancien Regime and the raw, violent theater of revolutionary vengeance. Illustrate the horrific betrayal of the guillotine's promised humanism, revealing the secret, calculated dulling of the execution blade by revolutionary decree to ensure prolonged suffering and heightened theatrical effect, forcing the machine to descend possibly 2 or 3 times upon the neck of the former queen, capturing the sheer, sublime horror of the realization that technological modernity was employed purely for amplified, ritualistic cruelty, a chilling indictment of enlightened progress corrupted by absolute terror. Depict the final, deliberate act of historical erasure, the unceremonious internment of the Queen's remains in an unmarked mass grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, her body quickly covered with vast amounts of quicklime, a testament to the revolutionary obsession not merely with death, but with the complete and absolute obliteration of memory and identity, ensuring that no future loyalist could ever find a site of pilgrimage or mournful reflection, a chilling study in political finality. Recreate the scene observed by the painter Jacques-Louis David, depicting the queen in the tumbril, her face a mask of deep, hollow-eyed resignation rather than fear or defiance, her brutally shorn white hair emphasizing her fragility, focusing on the composition of profound, exhausted defeat against the overwhelming, chaotic backdrop of the screaming, vicious 30,000-strong Parisian crowd, documenting the physical manifestation of a broken spirit awaiting its fate. Craft an epic, sweeping visual representing the execution as the true, ominous harbinger of the ensuing reign of terror, where Marie Antoinette's death becomes the ritualistic blueprint for industrialized political murder, illustrating the guillotine not as an instrument of justice, but as the central, terrifying symbol presiding over the rapid cascade of 16,594 subsequent state-sanctioned killings, marking the moment when vengeful passion completely superseded the rule of law. Focus a close-up on the desperate, intimate detail of the 76 tiny scratch marks, a calendar carved by the queen's fingernail into the damp stone wall of her cell, each mark measuring the agonizing countdown to her demise. Contrasting this fragile evidence of human resilience and temporal measurement against the crushing, brutal confinement of the conciergerie dungeon, a deeply romantic representation of inner life surviving amidst